Welcome, weary traveller, to the tale of a man whose name became synonymous with ambition's darkest turns. Tonight, we follow the complex life of Lucius Malfoy, a wizard born to privilege, yet enslaved by pride, a father whose love became twisted by legacy's weight, a servant who mistook power for purpose. As you settle into comfort, let these words carry you through the rise and fall of perhaps the most conflicted soul in wizarding aristocracy. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of choices made in shadow and light, where every triumph carried the seeds of its own destruction. The year 1953 brought winter's bitter embrace to the ancient halls of Malfoy Manor, where frost painted the diamond-paned windows with crystalline artistry, and the wind whispered secrets through corridors that had witnessed 10 centuries of power, pride, and carefully orchestrated ambition. It was into this world of inherited privilege and calculated supremacy that Lucius Abraxas Malfoy drew his first breath, a child born not merely into wealth, but into the weight of legacy itself. His pale features already marked by the distinctive pointed elegance that had defined his bloodline since time immemorial. The manor that cradled his earliest years stood as testament to everything the Malfoy name represented. Vast rooms filled with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow visitors with knowing intelligence, their subjects draped in the finest fabrics that gold could commission and magic could preserve. Each painting told a story of accumulation, of power seized and held through generations of careful maneuvering, of a family that had learned to bend the world to their will, through methods both subtle and absolute. Young Lucius would spend hours studying these faces, learning without words that greatness was not achieved, but inherited, not earned, but claimed by those bold enough to take what they believed was rightfully theirs. His mother, whose name history would forget but whose influence shaped the early years of one who would become infamous, moved through the manor's corridors with the quiet grace of someone who understood that true power often wore the mask of genteel refinement. She taught her son that appearances were everything, that the right words spoken at the right moment could accomplish more than any amount of crude force, that maintaining the facade of respectability was essential to the Malfoy way of wielding influence. Her lessons were delivered with the patience of someone who knew that proper education took time, that shaping a future patriarch required attention to details that lesser families might overlook. But it was Abraxas Malfoy, the boy's father, who served as the primary architect of Lucius's worldview and the source of both his greatest strengths and most devastating weaknesses. Abraxas was a man whose very presence seemed to command the air around him, whose pale grey eyes held the accumulated wisdom of centuries of Malfoy ambition, whose every gesture spoke of someone who had never doubted his place at the pinnacle of wizarding society. He had inherited not just wealth and property, but a philosophy of superiority that he passed to his son with the same methodical care that others might use to teach languages or mathematics. The lessons began before Lucius could properly hold a wand, delivered through stories that painted the world in stark divisions between those who mattered and those who served, between pure-blood wizards who carried magic in their very essence and the lesser beings who existed to support their betters. Abraxas spoke of blood as destiny, of magical heritage as the ultimate determiner of worth, of the natural order that placed families like theirs at the apex of creation, while relegating others to various levels of insignificance based on their distance from pure-blood perfection. Yet beneath these lessons lay a profound irony that would haunt the Malfoy legacy like a curse woven into their very foundation. The wealth that enabled their supremacist beliefs, the power that allowed them to look down upon others as inferior, had been built through centuries of exactly the kind of mingling that they now proclaimed to despise. The family's rise to prominence had begun not through magical superiority, but through shrewd political maneuvering that required close cooperation with Muggle nobility, marriages that diluted their pure-blood status, even as they enhanced their material fortunes. Armand Malfoy, the ancestor whose arrival with William the Conqueror had established the family's foothold in Britain, had been a pragmatist above all else, someone who understood that survival and success required adaptation rather than rigid adherence to ideological purity. He had married Muggle women when such unions advanced his interests, had made business deals with non-magical partners when profit demanded such collaboration, had built the foundation of Malfoy power through exactly the kind of blood mixing that his descendants would later claim to find abhorrent. The contradiction was carefully hidden, buried beneath generations of revisionist family history that portrayed their Muggle connections as temporary necessities rather than fundamental aspects of their rise to power. When the International Statute of Secrecy was established in 1692, officially separating the magical and non-magical worlds, the Malfoys had seized the opportunity to reinvent their past, claiming pure-blood heritage that their actual genealogy couldn't support while using their accumulated wealth to purchase the kind of social standing that birth alone couldn't provide. This transformation from pragmatic opportunists to ideological purists reflected the family's greatest talent, the ability to adapt their public persona to match changing circumstances while never losing sight of their ultimate goal of maintaining power and influence. They had learned to be whatever the times demanded, collaborators when collaboration served them, supremacists when supremacy offered advantages, always positioning themselves on the winning side of any conflict while ensuring that their core interests remained protected regardless of which ideology they publicly supported. Young Lucius absorbed these contradictions without understanding their full implications, seeing only the final result of centuries of careful construction rather than the compromised foundations upon which his family's prominence rested. He learned to take pride in pure-blood heritage that was largely fictional, to despise blood mixing that had actually created his family's success, to embrace an ideology that condemned the very strategies his ancestors had used to build the power he now inherited. His childhood was spent in rooms where house elves moved with silent efficiency, their servitude so complete and their presence so constant that he never questioned the natural order that placed magical creatures in bondage to wizard families. Dobby, the elf who had served the Malfoys for generations, became as familiar as the furniture, a being whose obvious intelligence and magical capabilities were somehow rendered irrelevant by his species and his slavery. The contradiction never occurred to young Lucius, who saw only what his education had prepared him to see, a natural hierarchy that justified his position at its apex. The manor itself served as his primary classroom, its every corner designed to reinforce lessons about power, wealth, and the importance of maintaining proper appearances. The drawing room where his parents entertained guests from pure-blood society showcased artifacts that had been collected over centuries, each piece chosen, not just for its beauty or magical properties, but for its ability to demonstrate the family's refined taste and substantial resources. The dining room featured a table that could seat dozens, surrounded by chairs that had been occupied by ministers of magic, prominent Wisengamot members, and other figures whose presence validated the Malfoys' position within the highest circles of magical society. But perhaps the most significant educational tool was the library, a vast room filled with books that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about magic, politics, and the art of wielding influence without appearing to do so. Here, young Lucius learned to read not just words but implications, to understand how power really worked in the wizarding world, to appreciate the subtle methods through which families like his maintained their dominance over those who might otherwise challenge their authority. The books his father selected for his education were carefully chosen to reinforce specific lessons about blood purity, magical superiority, and the natural order that placed pure blood wizards above all other beings. Treatises on magical theory that emphasized the importance of hereditary, magical ability, historical accounts that portrayed Muggle-born wizards as aberrations rather than equals, political philosophy that justified inequality through appeals to natural hierarchy. All of these shaped his understanding of how the world worked and where he fit within its structure. His early magical education began long before he received his Hogwarts letter, delivered through private tutors who understood the importance of providing young, pure-blood heirs with advantages that common wizarding children couldn't access. He learned advanced theoretical concepts while his future classmates were still struggling with basic spell recognition, mastered complex wand movements that wouldn't be taught in formal settings until advanced years, developed an intuitive understanding of magical principles that would serve him throughout his life. But beyond specific magical knowledge, these early lessons emphasized the importance of presentation, of maintaining the kind of sophisticated demeanor that marked someone as belonging to the wizarding elite. He learned to speak with the precise diction that indicated extensive education, to move with the controlled grace that suggested comfort with authority, to project the quiet confidence that came from never doubting one's place in the world's natural hierarchy. His physical appearance, which would become so distinctive in later years, was carefully cultivated from childhood through attention to details that lesser families might consider unimportant. His platinum hair was maintained in styles that emphasized the aristocratic bone structure he had inherited from centuries of careful breeding. His clothing was tailored to project wealth without ostentation. His bearing was trained to suggest inherent superiority, without the crude arrogance that marked nouveau rich families who hadn't learned proper restraint. The social aspects of his education were equally thorough, delivered through carefully orchestrated interactions with children from other prominent pure-blood families who would form his peer group throughout his life. These early friendships were less about personal compatibility than about reinforcing social hierarchies, creating bonds that would prove valuable in adult political maneuvering, establishing networks of mutual obligation that could be called upon when circumstances required coordinated action. Yet even as he learned to embrace his family's supremacist ideology, young Lucius was also developing the psychological characteristics that would define his adult personality, the deep-seated need for control that came from being raised with absolute authority over others, the inability to accept failure that resulted from never experiencing meaningful consequences for his actions, the profound fear of losing status that drove him to increasingly desperate measures when his position was threatened. His relationship with his parents, while loving in its way, was built upon expectations rather than unconditional acceptance, conditional upon his willingness to embody everything the Malfoy name represented, rather than developing his own independent identity. He learned early that love within his family was earned through performance, that approval depended upon maintaining standards that admitted no compromise, that belonging required accepting beliefs and behaviors that might conflict with other values or instincts. The house elves who served his family became his first subjects, beings upon whom he could practice the kind of casual cruelty that his ideology taught him was natural and appropriate. His treatment of Dobby, which would later prove so consequential, began as simple childhood thoughtlessness but evolved into systematic psychological abuse that reflected his deep internalization of supremacist beliefs about the natural hierarchy between magical beings. As his 11th birthday approached, young Lucius Malfoy stood at the threshold of formal magical education, already shaped by forces that had been working to mold him for centuries before his birth. He carried within himself the accumulated ambitions of 10 generations of ancestors, the weight of expectations that demanded nothing less than the continuation and enhancement of everything his family represented. His pale grey eyes had learned to see the world as territory to be conquered. His pointed features had been trained to project the kind of aristocratic disdain that kept others at appropriate distances. His mind had been filled with beliefs that would drive him toward choices that seemed inevitable given his upbringing. The Hogwarts letter that would arrive at Malfoy Manor was not an invitation to discovery, but a confirmation of destiny, another step in a journey that had been planned before he drew breath, another opportunity to demonstrate the superiority that his birth had supposedly guaranteed. He would enter that ancient castle, not as a curious child, eager to learn about magic, but as a young aristocrat, prepared to claim his rightful place among the wizarding elite, armed with advantages that gold could buy and breeding could provide, shaped by an ideology that brooked no challenge to its fundamental assumptions about worth, power, and the natural order of things. But within this carefully constructed identity lay the seeds of everything that would later bring him such pain. The inability to adapt when circumstances changed, the dependence upon external validation that made him vulnerable to stronger personalities, the hollow core where authentic self-knowledge should have resided but had been replaced with inherited prejudices and learned behaviors. The boy who would become one of Voldemort's most devoted followers was already being prepared for that role, though he understood it only as preparation for the kind of leadership that his birthright had promised him. The ancient stones of Malfoy Manor had witnessed the creation of another generation's heir, another young wizard destined to carry forward traditions that were both magnificent and terrible, both powerful and ultimately self-destructive. The legacy that had shaped him would continue to shape him, guiding his choices through paths that seemed to offer everything he had been taught to desire while leading him toward consequences that no amount of gold or breeding could prevent. The September morning that would forever alter the trajectory of Lucius Malfoy's life dawned with the crystalline clarity that often marks moments of profound transition, the autumn air carrying whispers of change that seemed to dance through the ancient corridors of Malfoy Manor, like prophecy made manifest. At 11 years old, he stood before the towering windows of his father's study, his pale reflection ghost-like against glass that had witnessed centuries of Malfoy departures for Hogwarts, each generation carrying forward the weight of family expectations and the burden of maintaining a legacy built upon power, privilege, and the careful cultivation of supremacist ideologies that had become as integral to their identity as the platinum hair that marked their bloodline. His trunk, crafted from the finest materials that wealth could procure, and enchanted with protective spells that most families couldn't afford, sat packed with robes of perfect cut, and books whose advanced content would give him advantages over classmates who relied solely upon standard curriculum. But more than material advantages, he carried within himself the accumulated wisdom of 10 generations of political maneuvering, the instinctive understanding of how power operated within wizarding society, and the unshakable conviction that his pure-blood heritage destined him for greatness that lesser beings could neither achieve nor truly comprehend. The journey to King's Cross Station unfolded with the ceremony that marked all significant Malfoy occasions, his parents' carriage arriving at the platform with punctuality that spoke of careful planning and attention to detail that characterized everything the family undertook. Abraxas Malfoy, resplendent in robes that whispered of old money and older traditions, surveyed the crowd with the calculating gaze of someone who saw potential allies and enemies rather than fellow parents sending children off to school. His mother, elegant and composed, radiated the quiet authority that came from never doubting one's place in the natural hierarchy that governed their world. The Hogwarts Express stood before them like a bridge between childhood and destiny, its scarlet exterior gleaming in the morning light while steam rose from its engine, like incense offered to the gods of tradition and continuity. Around them, the platform buzzed with activity that Lucius had been taught to categorize and evaluate. Pure blood families whose names he recognized from his father's political discussions, half-bloods whose uncertain heritage marked them as potentially useful but ultimately inferior, and the occasional Muggle-born family whose presence among magical society his upbringing had taught him to view as an aberration that undermined the natural order. His compartment had been reserved through the kind of quiet influence that the Malfoy name commanded, ensuring privacy and comfort that would allow him to make the right kind of first impressions on carefully selected fellow passengers. As the train pulled away from the platform, carrying him toward the ancient castle that had educated Malfoys for centuries, he felt not excitement but satisfaction, the deep contentment that comes from following a path that had been laid out with meticulous care and promised outcomes that aligned perfectly with everything he had been raised to expect from life. The conversation during that first journey revealed the sophisticated political awareness that his father's tutelage had instilled as he discussed ministry policies and wizarding society dynamics with the casual authority of someone who had been raised within circles where such matters were daily conversation rather than abstract concepts. His fellow Slytherin-bound passengers, recognizing both his knowledge and his family's influence, naturally gravitated toward him as a leader whose guidance could prove valuable in navigating the complex social hierarchies that governed Hogwarts life. The sorting ceremony itself was mere formality, the ancient hat requiring only seconds to recognize qualities that had been bred and trained into his character over 11 years of careful preparation. Slytherin House welcomed him not as a stranger, but as someone returning to his natural home, surrounded by children whose families shared similar values and whose futures would likely intertwine with his own in the political and social networks that truly governed magical Britain beyond the official structures that impressed those who didn't understand how power really operated. His first weeks at Hogwarts unfolded with the smooth precision that characterized everything in his life, each day bringing new opportunities to demonstrate the advantages that his upbringing had provided, while establishing himself as a natural leader among his peers. The professors, many of whom remembered his father and grandfather with varying degrees of respect and wariness, treated him with the deference that his family name commanded, while recognizing in his academic performance the kind of excellence that came from superior preparation rather than mere natural ability. But it was his meeting with Narcissa Black that would prove most significant for his future, though at 11 he understood it only as an encounter with someone whose beauty was matched by her obvious quality, and whose family heritage rivaled his own in antiquity and respectability. She moved through the castle corridors with the unconscious grace that marked true aristocracy, her dark hair and striking features drawing attention that she acknowledged with the kind of composed confidence that came from never doubting her place in any social hierarchy. Their conversations, initially formal exchanges appropriate to their ages and social positions, gradually evolved into something deeper as they recognized in each other kindred spirits shaped by similar upbringings and destined for similar roles in maintaining the traditions and values that their families represented. She understood, without need for explanation, the weight of expectations that rested upon his shoulders, while he appreciated the intelligence and strength of character that lay beneath her carefully maintained exterior of perfect pure-blood femininity. Their developing relationship became a model of what such connections should be, built upon shared values rather than mere attraction, designed to strengthen both families, rather than serving only personal desires, conducted with the kind of propriety that befitted their stations while acknowledging the deeper compatibility that would make their eventual union both politically advantageous and personally satisfying. Other students watched their courtship with the kind of fascination that naturally surrounds those destined for prominence, understanding intuitively that they were witnessing the formation of a partnership that would likely influence wizarding society for generations to come. His academic performance during these years reflected the superior preparation he had received, though he approached his studies with the calculated effort of someone who understood that excellence was expected rather than hoped for. Transfiguration, potions, defense against the dark arts. Each subject became another opportunity to demonstrate the kind of mastery that his private tutoring had made possible, while his professors noted not just his capabilities, but the sophisticated understanding of magical theory that suggested education far beyond what most 11-year-olds received. The invitation to Slughorn's Slug Club came as recognition not just of his academic abilities, but of his family's prominence and the professor's understanding that cultivating relationships with promising students from influential families served everyone's interests. The club's meetings provided opportunities to network with older students whose families moved in the same circles as his own, while Slughorn's stories of former students who had achieved positions of power and influence served as both entertainment and education about how success in the wizarding world really worked. But perhaps more significantly, these gatherings allowed him to observe and learn from students whose ambitions aligned with his own, whose understanding of politics and power matched the sophistication that his upbringing had provided. He learned to read the subtle dynamics that governed such interactions, to recognize who possessed real influence versus who merely appeared impressive, to understand how information and favors flowed through networks that existed parallel to, but separate from official channels. His relationship with Severus Snape, begun with a gesture of welcome when the younger boy joined Slytherin, evolved into something resembling mentorship, as Lucius recognized qualities in Severus that reminded him of his own ambitions, while understanding that the half-blood's background created both opportunities and limitations that pure-blood status didn't impose. Severus possessed intellectual gifts that impressed even someone as well-educated as Lucius, but his family circumstances created hungers and resentments that pure-blood heirs couldn't fully comprehend. The mutual respect that developed between them was built upon recognition of each other's strengths, while acknowledging the different paths their backgrounds would likely create. Lucius could offer protection and guidance that Severus's muggle father and struggling mother couldn't provide, while Severus demonstrated the kind of magical innovation and theoretical understanding that impressed someone who had been raised to appreciate excellence in all its forms. Their friendship, though limited by social realities that neither could entirely overcome, became a model of how pure-blood leadership could incorporate talented individuals whose heritage might otherwise exclude them from positions of influence. Yet even as these relationships developed, Lucius found himself increasingly troubled by aspects of Hogwarts life that seemed to challenge or undermine the values his father had taught him to embrace. The presence of Muggle-born students who demonstrated magical abilities that rivaled or exceeded those of pure-blood classmates created cognitive dissonance that he resolved by attributing their success to stolen magic or unnatural advantages, rather than questioning the fundamental premises upon which his worldview rested. More troubling was the growing influence of Professor Dumbledore, whose progressive attitudes toward blood status and magical creature rights represented everything that Abraxas Malfoy had taught his son to oppose. Dumbledore's obvious intelligence and magical power made him a formidable opponent, while his position of authority within the school created a platform from which he could spread ideas that challenged traditional hierarchies and questioned assumptions that families like the Malfoys considered fundamental to proper wizarding society. The young Lucius watched with growing concern as Dumbledore's influence shaped school policies and student attitudes in ways that seemed designed to undermine the natural order that had governed magical society for centuries. The professor's apparent belief that blood status was irrelevant to magical ability or personal worth struck at the very foundation of everything Lucius had been taught about his own identity and destiny, while his advocacy for magical creature rights suggested a dangerous blurring of boundaries that had kept different species in their proper places. These concerns were amplified by letters from home that described increasing unrest within wizarding society, whispers of a powerful dark wizard who was gathering followers and promising to restore traditional values that progressive elements had been working to erode. Abraxas wrote carefully, understanding that Owlpost was not entirely secure, but his meaning was clear. Change was coming to the wizarding world, and those who understood the importance of blood purity and proper hierarchy would need to choose sides when that change arrived. The name Voldemort began to appear in these letters with increasing frequency, always accompanied by descriptions of someone whose vision for magical society aligned perfectly with everything the Malfoy family represented. Here was a leader who understood that pure-blood wizards deserved to rule by virtue of their superior heritage, who recognized that Muggleborns represented a contamination of magical society that needed to be addressed, who promised to restore the kind of order that would allow families like theirs to exercise the influence that their bloodlines and abilities naturally merited. As Lucius progressed through his Hogwarts years, these external influences began to shape his understanding of his role in the conflicts that were developing beyond the castle walls. He was not merely a student preparing for adult life, but a future leader who would need to take active roles in preserving and advancing the interests of pure-blood society against forces that sought to diminish or destroy everything his ancestors had built. His academic focus shifted accordingly, with increased attention to subjects that would prepare him for the kind of leadership his birthright demanded. Defense against the dark arts became particularly important, not just for the magical knowledge it provided, but for the strategic thinking it encouraged about threats and responses, enemies and allies. He studied not just spells and counterspells, but the psychology of conflict, the dynamics of power, the methods through which superior individuals could impose their will upon those who lacked the strength or wisdom to govern themselves. His final years at Hogwarts were marked by a growing sense of anticipation, as the outside world's conflicts began to penetrate even the castle's ancient protections. Students arrived with stories of mysterious disappearances and unexplained attacks, while professors spoke in hushed tones about developments that they couldn't or wouldn't discuss openly. The divisions between those who supported traditional values and those who embraced dangerous progressive ideas became increasingly apparent, creating tensions that made neutrality impossible for anyone with strong convictions about how magical society should be organized. Dumbledore's appointment as headmaster represented a victory for forces that Lucius had learned to oppose, a development that his father's letters described as potentially catastrophic for the future of wizarding civilization. Here was someone whose influence over multiple generations of magical children could reshape society in ways that undermined everything pure-blood families had worked to preserve, whose power and position made him perhaps the greatest threat to traditional values that had ever existed within Britain's magical institutions. The appointment confirmed everything Abraxas had taught his son about the importance of political vigilance and the dangers of allowing progressive elements to gain positions of institutional authority. Dumbledore's control over Hogwarts meant that countless young witches and wizards would be exposed to ideas that challenged natural hierarchies, questioned traditional assumptions, and encouraged the kind of thinking that led to social chaos and the erosion of proper order. As graduation approached, Lucius understood that he was preparing to enter a world where the conflicts that had been developing throughout his school years would soon explode into open warfare between incompatible visions of magical society's future. His education had prepared him not just with knowledge and skills, but with absolute certainty about which side deserved victory, which values merited defense, and which leaders possessed the strength and wisdom necessary to guide wizarding civilization through the trials that lay ahead. His relationship with Narcissa had deepened during these years into something that transcended mere romantic attachment, becoming a partnership built upon shared understanding of their roles in preserving and advancing everything their families represented. They discussed not just personal futures but dynastic responsibilities, not just individual desires but the obligations that their bloodlines imposed upon them. Their love was real and deep, but it was also purposeful, designed to serve causes larger than themselves, while creating the kind of personal happiness that came from perfect alignment between individual fulfillment and familial duty. The graduation ceremony that marked the end of his Hogwarts education was also the beginning of his adult responsibilities as a Malfoy heir. As someone whose name carried the accumulated weight of centuries of family achievement and whose future choices would determine whether that legacy continued to grow or began to decline, he left the castle not with sadness at endings but with eagerness for opportunities to prove himself worthy of everything his bloodline represented, armed with education and connections that would serve him well in the battles that everyone knew were coming. The young man who departed Hogwarts that final time carried within himself all the advantages that birth and breeding could provide, all the knowledge that gold could purchase and influence could arrange, all the confidence that came from never doubting his place in the world's natural order. But he also carried the limitations that such advantages imposed, the inability to question fundamental assumptions, the dependence upon external validation that came from inherited rather than earned status, the hollow spaces where authentic self-knowledge should have resided, but had been filled instead with family ideology and social expectations. The world that awaited him was one where his advantages would initially serve him well, where his connections and resources would open doors and create opportunities, where his absolute certainty about right and wrong would seem like strength rather than limitation. But it was also a world where those same qualities would eventually lead him toward choices that no amount of pure-blood heritage could justify, toward alliances that would demand more than he understood he was offering, toward a future that would test every assumption about power, loyalty, and the price of maintaining beliefs when reality refused to conform to ideology. The dance with darkness was about to begin, though the young man who had just graduated with such distinction could not have imagined how completely that dance would transform him, how thoroughly it would consume everything he thought he valued, how ultimately it would require him to choose between the ideology that had shaped his identity and the family that had given his life meaning. For now, he knew only excitement at the opportunities that awaited, satisfaction at having completed his education with such success, and absolute confidence that the future would validate every lesson his father had taught him about power, blood, and destiny. The summer of 1874 brought news that would forever alter the trajectory of Lucius Malfoy's carefully planned ascent through wizarding society, arriving on wings of owl post that carried both sorrow and opportunity in equal measure. Abraxas Malfoy, patriarch of one of Britain's most ancient magical families, had succumbed to dragonpox despite the best healing that gold could procure and influence could arrange, leaving behind a grieving widow and a son whose inheritance would transform him overnight from wealthy heir to one of the most powerful young wizards in magical society. The funeral service conducted within the private chapel at Malfoy Manor was attended by representatives from every prominent pure-blood family in Britain, their presence serving as testament not just to Abraxas's personal influence, but to the respect that centuries of careful political maneuvering had earned for the Malfoy name. Ministers and former ministers of magic stood beside Wizengamot members and department heads, their somber robes creating a sea of authority that spoke to the networks of obligation and alliance that Abraxas had spent his lifetime constructing and maintaining through methods both subtle and direct. Young Lucius, barely 21, and still adjusting to the weight of expectations that full adulthood had placed upon his shoulders, found himself thrust into a position of responsibility that would have overwhelmed lesser men. The family fortune, accumulated over 10 centuries of shrewd investments and political connections, was now his to manage and expand. Malfoy Manor itself, with its hundreds of rooms and thousands of acres, required oversight that went far beyond simple maintenance to encompass the kind of estate management that preserved and enhanced both wealth and influence across generations. But perhaps most significantly, he inherited Dobby, the house elf whose family had served the Malfoys for generations uncounted, whose intimate knowledge of family secrets and absolute magical bondage made him both invaluable resource and potential liability. The elf's obvious intelligence and powerful magical abilities were rendered irrelevant by his species and his enslavement, creating a relationship that perfectly embodied the supremacist ideology that Lucius had been raised to embrace without question or moral consideration. His treatment of Dobby from the earliest days of his inheritance revealed the depths to which his upbringing had shaped his understanding of natural hierarchy and appropriate relationships between superior and inferior beings. The elf's desperate desire to please was met with casual cruelty that served no purpose beyond reinforcing dominance relationships that Lucius considered essential to maintaining proper order. Each punishment was delivered with the cold efficiency of someone who genuinely believed that such treatment was not only justified but necessary for preserving the social structures that kept different species in their assigned places. The manor itself became his canvas for displaying the kind of sophisticated taste that marked true aristocracy, its grounds transformed through magical landscaping that created environments of breathtaking beauty while demonstrating the resources required for such ambitious projects. The peacocks that roamed freely across perfectly manicured lawns served as living symbols of exotic luxury, their brilliant plumage and regal bearing reflecting qualities that Lucius saw in himself and his family, while their obvious superiority to common fowl reinforced lessons about breeding and natural aristocracy that extended far beyond simple animal husbandry. The exotic plants that filled his conservatories and gardens represented botanical treasures gathered from magical locations around the world, each specimen chosen not just for its beauty but for its rarity and the resources required to obtain and maintain it. These living displays served multiple purposes, demonstrating wealth through their acquisition costs, showcasing magical knowledge through their successful cultivation, and providing conversation pieces that allowed him to display his sophisticated understanding of magical botany to visitors whose respect and alliance he sought to cultivate. But beyond mere aesthetic improvements, Lucius understood that his true inheritance lay not in physical assets, but in the networks of influence that his father had spent decades constructing through careful attention to the needs and weaknesses of key figures within magical, government, and society. The young heir threw himself into this political dimension of his responsibilities with enthusiasm that reflected both natural aptitude and careful training. recognizing that maintaining Malfoy prominence required active cultivation of relationships that could provide access to information, influence over policy decisions, and protection against enemies who might seek to diminish his family's position. His frequent appearances at the Ministry of Magic were carefully orchestrated performances designed to reinforce his position within the informal hierarchies that actually governed magical Britain. Beyond the official organizational charts that impressed those who didn't understand how power really operated, he moved through the ministry's corridors with the confident bearing of someone who belonged in such settings, his expensive robes and cultured manner marking him as a person of consequence, whose presence commanded attention and respect from officials who understood the advantages that alliance with wealthy pureblood families could provide. The art of bribery, which his father had practiced with such subtle skill that recipients often failed to recognize the transactions for what they were, became Lucius's specialty as he learned to identify the specific needs and desires that motivated different officials while providing benefits that created lasting obligations without obvious impropriety. Gold changed hands through charitable donations that supported causes dear to particular recipients. Business opportunities appeared for family members who needed employment. Social invitations provided access to circles that ambition alone couldn't penetrate. These investments in human nature paid dividends that extended far beyond their immediate costs, creating networks of mutual dependence that allowed him to influence policy decisions, delay unfavorable legislation, and gather intelligence about government activities that might affect his interests or those of allies whose support he needed for his own projects. The web of obligation and advantage that he wove through such methods became one of his most valuable assets, providing protection against enemies while creating opportunities that official channels could never offer. But parallel to his growing political influence, Lucius was also deepening his relationship with Narcissa Black, the beautiful and intelligent young woman whose pure blood heritage rivaled his own, while her personal qualities promised the kind of partnership that could strengthen both families while providing the emotional satisfaction that made political alliances worthwhile on human levels. Their courtship, conducted with all the propriety that their stations demanded, was also a negotiation between two ancient families whose union would create dynastic possibilities that neither could achieve independently. Narcissa brought to their relationship not just beauty and breeding, but intelligence and strength of character that complemented his own ambitions while providing the kind of support that successful men required from their wives. She understood intuitively the demands that his position placed upon him, the careful balance between public prominence and private calculation that maintained influence, while avoiding the kind of visibility that made enemies or attracted unwanted attention from those who might question his methods. Her own family's prominence within pure-blood society provided additional connections and opportunities that enhanced the political value of their union, while her personal wealth eliminated any suggestion that financial considerations influenced their relationship. The Black family's ancient heritage and accumulated power made her an equal partner rather than dependent bride, someone whose contributions to their shared future would match his own, while her obvious devotion provided emotional grounding that ambitious men often lacked. Their engagement announcement was celebrated throughout pure-blood society as a union that promised to strengthen traditional values while creating a new generation of leadership that could preserve and advance everything their families represented. The wedding itself, conducted with all the ceremony that ancient traditions demanded, was attended by the most prominent figures in magical Britain, their presence serving as endorsement of both families while creating opportunities for political connections that would serve the newly married couple throughout their lives. But even as he celebrated these personal triumphs, Lucius was becoming increasingly aware of political developments within wizarding society that demanded careful attention and strategic planning. The whispers that had begun during his Hogwarts years about a powerful dark wizard gathering followers had evolved into open discussions about someone whose ideology aligned perfectly with everything the Malfoy family represented, whose vision for magical society promised to restore the kind of order that progressive elements had been working to undermine. The name Voldemort had begun appearing with increasing frequency in conversations among pureblood families who shared concerns about the direction that magical society was taking under the influence of blood traitors and muggle lovers who failed to understand the importance of maintaining proper hierarchies. Here was someone who possessed not just magical power but political vision, someone who understood that pure-blood wizards deserved to rule by virtue of their superior heritage, while recognizing that such rule required strong leadership, capable of imposing necessary order upon those who lacked the wisdom to govern themselves properly. The decision to seek audience with this rising leader was made not from desperation or weakness, but from recognition that historical moments demanded decisive action from those positioned to influence outcomes. Lucius understood that remaining neutral when fundamental questions about magical society's future were being decided would be interpreted as weakness by both sides, while potentially placing him on the wrong side of conflicts that could determine his family's fate for generations to come. The meeting that would change the entire course of his life took place in circumstances that emphasized both the secrecy required by political necessity and the importance of the decisions being made by those brave enough to envision radical solutions to problems that conventional approaches had failed to address. Voldemort, when Lucius finally encountered him, proved to be everything that whispered reports had suggested: intelligent beyond normal human limitations, magically powerful in ways that defied conventional understanding, and absolutely committed to achieving the kind of transformation that magical society desperately needed. The Dark Lord's vision for the future resonated perfectly with everything Lucius had been taught about blood purity, natural hierarchy, and the proper relationship between superior and inferior beings. Here was someone who understood that Muggle-borns represented contamination of magical society that needed to be addressed through methods that squeamish progressives lacked the courage to implement, someone who recognized that magical creatures belonged in servitude to wizards whose superior abilities qualified them for dominance, someone who possessed the strength and determination necessary to restore order that centuries of misguided liberalism had disrupted. The invitation to join Voldemort's inner circle came not as surprise but as recognition of qualities that Lucius had spent his entire life developing: wealth that could fund ambitious projects, political connections that could provide intelligence and influence, social position that could lend respectability to causes that required careful presentation to avoid premature opposition. His acceptance of the Dark Mark was conducted with ceremony appropriate to the historic nature of the commitment he was making, understanding that he was pledging not just personal loyalty, but family honor to a cause that promised to reshape wizarding civilization. The tattoo that appeared upon his left arm carried significance that extended far beyond its role as identification or communication device, serving as permanent reminder of obligations that transcended personal interests, while marking him as member of an elite organization dedicated to achieving goals that conventional politics could never accomplish. The pain of its application was welcomed as necessary sacrifice, proof of commitment that distinguished true believers from casual supporters who lacked courage for difficult choices that meaningful change required. His rise through Death Eater ranks reflected both his natural abilities and the resources that his inheritance provided for advancing their shared cause. The intelligence networks he had developed through ministry connections proved invaluable for identifying opportunities and avoiding dangers, while his wealth funded operations that required resources beyond what most followers could contribute individually. His social position allowed him to maintain respectability that provided cover for activities that might otherwise attract attention from authorities who didn't understand the necessity of methods being employed. But perhaps most importantly, his absolute commitment to Voldemort's vision provided psychological foundation that sustained him through challenges that might have broken those whose dedication was based upon personal advantage rather than ideological conviction. He genuinely believed that everything he was doing served not just his own interests, but the greater good of magical society, that the sacrifices being demanded were justified by outcomes that would benefit future generations of magical beings who would inherit a properly ordered world. The trust that Voldemort placed in him by entrusting him with the diary represented recognition of loyalty that had been proven through action rather than mere words. Acknowledgement that among all his followers, Lucius possessed combination of resources, connections, and absolute reliability that made him uniquely valuable for the most sensitive missions. The artifact itself, though its full significance remained hidden, was obviously something of enormous importance to the Dark Lord, something that required protection by someone whose discretion and security measures could be trusted completely. The diary's appearance was unremarkable, giving no hint of the power that lay dormant within its pages, or the role it was destined to play in future events that would test loyalties and reveal the true costs of the choices being made by those who served causes larger than themselves. Lucius accepted the responsibility with pride that came from being selected for such honor, while understanding that failure to protect it adequately would result in consequences that extended far beyond personal punishment to encompass everything he valued most. As Voldemort's most trusted lieutenant, Lucius found himself privy to strategic planning that revealed the true scope of their leader's vision, while demonstrating the careful calculation that lay beneath what enemies portrayed as random violence or mindless hatred. Every attack was planned with precision that served larger goals. Every target was selected for maximum impact upon enemy morale, while advancing specific objectives that contributed to ultimate victory that seemed increasingly inevitable as their movement gained strength and momentum. The battles he helped plan, and sometimes led personally, were conducted with tactical sophistication that reflected his understanding of how power really operated within magical society, targeting not just obvious enemies, but the support networks that allowed resistance to function effectively. Ministry officials whose corruption could be exposed, order members whose families could be threatened, neutral parties whose continued neutrality could be eliminated through demonstration of consequences that awaited those who failed to choose sides appropriately. His success in these operations earned recognition that went beyond simple appreciation for services rendered to encompass acceptance as true partner in shaping the future that their movement was working to create. Voldemort's praise for his efforts carried weight that transcended personal validation, representing acknowledgement that his contributions were essential for achieving goals that required combination of magical power, political sophistication, and resources that few individuals could provide. The respect of fellow Death Eaters, earned through competence rather than inherited, provided satisfaction that his upbringing had not prepared him to expect, but which he found deeply meaningful as proof that his worth extended beyond family name and accumulated wealth to encompass genuine capabilities that served causes greater than personal advancement. For the first time in his life, he was valued for what he could do, rather than who he was born to be, earning position through merit rather than inheritance. But beneath these professional satisfactions lay personal fulfillment that came from finally finding purpose that aligned perfectly with his deepest convictions, cause that justified everything he had been taught about his own superiority, while providing outlets for ambitions that peacetime politics could never satisfy. The war that was developing offered opportunities to prove himself in ways that his comfortable inheritance had never demanded, testing courage and commitment, while providing chances to demonstrate leadership capabilities that his education had prepared him to exercise. The future that stretched before him seemed to promise everything that his birth and breeding had destined him to achieve. Power that extended beyond wealth, to encompass real influence over wizarding society's development, respect that was based upon accomplishment rather than inherited position, legacy that his own choices would create rather than simply maintaining what previous generations had built for him. Victory in the coming conflict would establish new order that placed families like his in positions of authority that reflected their natural qualifications, while ensuring that inferior elements could no longer threaten stability through misguided challenges to proper hierarchy. Yet even as these dreams took shape, the seeds of future disaster were already present in assumptions and beliefs that seemed so natural to him that questioning them never occurred as possibility. The absolute certainty that made him such an effective follower would also make it impossible for him to adapt when circumstances changed in ways that his ideology couldn't accommodate, while the emotional dependence upon external validation that drove his need for Voldemort's approval would leave him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone strong enough to demand submission rather than offering partnership. The young man who stood at the pinnacle of Death Eater hierarchy, surrounded by wealth and influence, and absolute confidence in his cause's righteousness, carried within himself contradictions that would eventually destroy everything he thought he was fighting to preserve. But for now, he knew only satisfaction at having found his true calling, excitement about battles yet to be fought, and complete faith that the future would validate every choice he had made, in service of ideals that seemed as permanent and unshakable as the ancient stones of Malfoy Manor itself. The night of October 31st, 1881, began like countless others in the privileged existence that Lucius Malfoy had crafted for himself through careful cultivation of power, influence, and absolute dedication to a cause that promised to reshape wizarding society according to principles he had been raised to consider sacred and immutable. In the elegant drawing room of Malfoy Manor, surrounded by artifacts that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and political sophistication, he sat reading correspondence from fellow Death Eaters, whose reports painted an increasingly optimistic picture of their movement's inexorable progress toward total victory over the forces of blood treason and misguided liberalism that had infected magical Britain for far too long. The dark mark upon his left arm had been unusually active throughout recent weeks, summoning him to meetings where Voldemort's confidence seemed to radiate like magical energy itself, where strategic discussions revealed plans so comprehensive and inevitable that opposition appeared not just futile, but almost pitifully naive. The Order of the Phoenix, that collection of idealistic fools, led by Dumbledore's misguided vision of equality and tolerance, was being systematically dismantled through operations that Lucius had helped design, their members falling one by one to superior planning and overwhelming magical force, directed by leadership that understood the true nature of power. His own role in these victories had earned recognition that filled him with satisfaction deeper than any inherited privilege could provide. Acknowledgement that his contributions extended far beyond the wealth and connections that his birth had provided to encompass genuine strategic insight and operational capabilities that served their cause with distinction. The intelligence networks he had developed within the ministry continued to provide invaluable information about government responses to their activities, while his social position allowed him to monitor and influence public opinion in ways that supported their broader campaign to prepare magical society for the new order that victory would establish. But it was the special mission that Voldemort had entrusted to him personally that provided the greatest source of pride and anticipation. The knowledge that his master had selected him above all others to eliminate the Potter family and their infant son, whose prophesied significance threatened everything they had worked to achieve. The Dark Lord's explanation of the prophecy's implications had been characteristically thorough, revealing how ancient magic and seers' visions intersected with practical politics to create challenges that required decisive action. From those with courage to make necessary choices, regardless of conventional morality or sentimental weakness. The boy's elimination would remove the last significant obstacle to complete victory, while demonstrating Voldemort's power over fate itself, his ability to overcome even prophetic pronouncements through superior will and magical capability that transcended ordinary limitations. Lucius understood the historical significance of the moment they were approaching, the way that events of single nights could reshape civilizations when guided by leaders who possessed vision and determination to act upon opportunities that lesser souls might hesitate to grasp. His preparations for the evening had been meticulous, as befitted someone whose entire life had been dedicated to understanding that success required attention to details that others might consider unimportant. His robes were perfect. His wand was in optimal condition. His mind was focused upon outcomes that would justify years of sacrifice and struggle, while validating every principle that his upbringing had taught him to revere. The Dark Mark's summoning, when it finally came, felt like destiny calling him to fulfill the role for which his birth and breeding had prepared him. But the signal that reached him through magical connection to his master was not the triumphant announcement of victory that he had expected. Instead, it carried undertones of confusion and impossible disaster, communications that spoke of magical phenomena that defied understanding, and outcomes that contradicted everything he thought he knew about power, prophecy, and the inevitable triumph of superior will over inferior resistance. The Dark Lord's presence, which had been so commanding and absolute just hours earlier, seemed suddenly diminished, as if something fundamental had been altered in ways that existing knowledge couldn't explain. The reports that began filtering through Death Eater communication networks painted a picture so impossible that Lucius initially dismissed them as enemy disinformation or panic-induced hallucinations from followers whose nerve had failed under pressure. Voldemort destroyed by infant magic. The Potter house blasted apart by forces that left the baby miraculously unharmed. The most powerful dark wizard in centuries reduced to something less than vapor by protection spells that mere parental love had supposedly created. Such claims defied every principle of magical theory and practical experience that his education had provided. Yet as additional confirmations arrived from sources whose reliability he couldn't question, the impossible reality began to penetrate his consciousness, like poison seeping through protective barriers that had been constructed to prevent exactly such devastating recognitions. The Dark Lord, whose power had seemed absolute and whose victory had appeared inevitable, was gone. The movement that had given his life meaning and purpose was leaderless. The new order that had promised to restore proper hierarchy to magical society was collapsing before it could be fully established. The implications struck him with force that transcended mere political disappointment to encompass existential crisis that challenged everything he understood about himself and his place in the world. Without Voldemort's leadership and the cause that had provided direction for his ambitions, what meaning could his life possess? Without the promised future that had justified every sacrifice and compromise, what value could his accumulated wealth and influence provide? Without the ideology that had shaped his identity since childhood, what foundation existed for continued existence? But even more immediate than these philosophical challenges were practical concerns that demanded attention regardless of his emotional state or intellectual confusion. Dawn would bring Ministry investigators whose questions would focus upon his known associations and suspected activities, auras whose loyalties to the Old Order would make them eager to settle scores with Death Eaters who had escaped justice through connections and influence rather than innocence. The network of relationships that had protected him during Voldemort's rise would become liabilities in the new environment that his master's defeat had created. His survival instincts, honed through years of political maneuvering in environments where mistakes carried severe consequences, began calculating responses that might preserve his freedom while distancing him from activities that could no longer be defended through appeals to ultimate victory. The Imperious Curse defense, though legally questionable and morally contemptible, offered possibilities for avoiding Azkaban if presented with sufficient skill and supported by influence that his wealth could still command despite changed circumstances. The curse itself was well documented in magical lore as unforgivable, precisely because it removed free will from its victims, creating legal precedent for claiming that actions performed under its influence couldn't be attributed to the apparent perpetrator's conscious choice. If he could convince authorities that his Death Eater activities had been conducted while magically compelled rather than voluntarily chosen, the legal system's own principles would require treating him as victim rather than criminal, despite the obvious convenience of such claims. The challenge lay in presenting such defense with convincing detail, while avoiding inconsistencies that experienced Auror interrogators could exploit to reveal deception. His story would need to account for years of activities while maintaining plausible deniability about specific incidents that might have left evidence connecting him to particular crimes. The wealth and connections that his family name provided would be essential for securing legal representation, sophisticated enough to navigate such complex claims, while ensuring that investigating authorities treated him with appropriate deference rather than the hostility that genuine Death Eaters deserved. His first step was securing his manor against immediate threats, understanding that changed political circumstances might embolden enemies who had been restrained by fear of retaliation during Voldemort's ascendancy. The protective wards that had always surrounded his property were reinforced through magical techniques that emphasized concealment and misdirection, rather than aggressive defense, creating barriers that would discourage casual investigation while avoiding the kind of obvious fortification that might suggest consciousness of guilt. The dark artifacts that filled various rooms throughout the manor posed particular challenges, as their presence could be interpreted as evidence of Death Eater sympathies, or worse, if discovered during official searches. Some could be concealed through magical means that made detection unlikely, while others required removal to locations where their discovery wouldn't compromise his emerging defense strategy. The diary that Voldemort had entrusted to him presented special difficulties, as its obvious importance to his master made keeping it dangerous, while disposing of it might eliminate valuable bargaining chips that future circumstances could require. His correspondence files required careful editing to remove communications that contradicted his planned defense, while preserving materials that supported claims of magical compulsion or demonstrated connections to respectable elements within wizarding society. Letters from ministry officials could be interpreted as evidence of coercion rather than collaboration if presented appropriately, while social invitations and charitable acknowledgements would help establish his reputation as valued member of magical society, whose supposed crimes were inconsistent with his actual character and behavioral patterns. The most challenging aspect of his preparation was psychological rather than practical, requiring him to construct mental frameworks that could sustain his planned deception while maintaining sufficient emotional stability to present convincing performance when official scrutiny arrived. He needed to believe, at least partially, in his own innocence, to embrace the narrative of victimization that his legal strategy required, while suppressing memories and knowledge that contradicted such claims. The technique required was similar to methods he had observed Voldemort using to compartmentalize information and emotion, creating mental barriers that prevented certain thoughts or feelings from interfering with immediate practical necessities. By convincing himself that his Death Eater activities had indeed been performed under magical compulsion, he could project the kind of genuine confusion and righteous indignation that would make his claims more believable to investigators whose own preconceptions might predispose them toward accepting explanations that avoided uncomfortable questions about how extensively their government had been infiltrated and compromised. When the Aurors finally arrived at Malfoy Manor 3 days after Voldemort's defeat, they encountered not a desperate criminal trying to avoid justice, but a respectable pure-blood heir who expressed appropriate shock and dismay at learning that he had been manipulated by dark forces beyond his understanding or control. His performance was masterful, combining genuine emotions of loss and confusion with calculated displays of cooperation and relief that convinced his interrogators that his crimes had been committed by someone other than the man who sat before them, expressing gratitude for liberation from magical compulsion. The legal proceedings that followed demonstrated the power of wealth and connections to influence outcomes even in cases where guilt seemed obvious to objective observers. His solicitors, the finest that magical Britain could provide, constructed defense strategies that exploited every procedural technicality while presenting evidence that supported their clients' claims of victimization rather than voluntary participation in terrorist activities. Character witnesses from prominent pure-blood families testified to his reputation for respectability and lawful behavior, while expert testimony about imperious curse effects created reasonable doubt about his mental state during the periods when his alleged crimes had been committed. The contrast between his treatment and the fate of fellow Death Eaters whose resources couldn't command such sophisticated representation was stark enough to generate commentary about justice being available primarily to those who could afford it. But such criticism carried little weight in a system where influence and wealth had always determined outcomes for those intelligent enough to understand how power really operated within seemingly impartial institutions. His acquittal, though technically based upon legal principles rather than political considerations, was widely understood as victory for old networks of privilege over new demands for accountability, demonstration that traditional hierarchies remained powerful enough to protect their members even when circumstances seemed to demand wholesale restructuring of magical society. The relief he felt at avoiding Azkaban was complicated by recognition that his victory had been purchased through methods that validated everything his enemies claimed about pure-blood corruption and entitlement. But survival was more important than moral consistency, freedom more valuable than ideological purity, and he emerged from the legal proceedings, determined to rebuild his life and reputation through whatever means proved necessary. The cause that had given his existence meaning was gone, but the resources and capabilities that had made him valuable to that cause remained available for new purposes and different forms of ambition. His first priority was repairing relationships that his Death Eater associations had damaged, understanding that isolation was more dangerous than any external threat in a world where political currents could shift with devastating speed. The charitable donations that began flowing from Malfoy coffers to various worthy causes served multiple purposes, demonstrating reformed attitudes that supported his legal defense claims, building goodwill among institutions and individuals whose support might prove valuable, and establishing public record of community involvement that contradicted enemy narratives about his character and motivations. St. Mungo's Hospital received substantial funding for research into curse damage and magical healing, contributions that were acknowledged with appropriate gratitude while providing opportunities for Lucius to associate himself publicly with healing rather than harm, restoration rather than destruction. The ministry itself benefited from his generosity through support for programs that served public welfare, donations that created paper trails, demonstrating his commitment to lawful governance and social stability, rather than the revolutionary changes that Death Eater ideology had promised to impose through violent means. But perhaps most significantly, Hogwarts School received endowments that established his family's continuing commitment to magical education, while positioning him for appointment to the Board of Governors, a role that would provide both social respectability and practical influence over policies that shaped future generations of magical society. The governorship would serve as public validation of his reformed status, while creating opportunities to advance his interests through legitimate channels rather than the illegal methods that had characterized his Death Eater years. The personal transformation that these activities required was profound but manageable for someone whose entire life had been dedicated to understanding how public perception could be shaped through careful attention to appearance and strategic action. The supremacist beliefs that had motivated his Death Eater service remained unchanged, but their expression necessarily became more subtle, channeled through respectable activities that advanced his agenda, while avoiding the kind of obvious extremism that post-war political climate made dangerous for anyone seeking mainstream acceptance. His relationship with Narcissa provided emotional anchor during this difficult transition, her understanding and support making it possible to navigate challenges that might have broken someone without such partnership. She had never taken the dark mark herself, though her sympathies had always aligned with his own, and her relative innocence of direct involvement in Death Eater activities made their marriage politically advantageous, as well as personally satisfying. Her family connections within pure-blood society remained intact, providing social network that his legal troubles might otherwise have compromised. The birth of their son Draco in 1880 arrived as crowning achievement of his successful rehabilitation, proof that his family's future remained bright, despite temporary setbacks that his enemies had hoped would destroy them permanently. The baby represented not just personal fulfillment but dynastic continuity, evidence that Malfoy influence would extend into new generations, regardless of political changes that had temporarily disrupted their plans for achieving complete dominance over magical society. His devotion to Draco was immediate and absolute, encompassing all the protective instincts and ambitious dreams that his own father had invested in him, while incorporating lessons learned through recent experiences about the importance of adaptability and pragmatic calculation over ideological purity. The boy would be raised with advantages that wealth could provide and connections could arrange, but also with understanding that survival and success required intelligence and flexibility, rather than rigid adherence to principles that changing circumstances might make liabilities. The nursery at Malfoy Manor became shrine to possibilities that the future might hold. Its luxurious appointments and magical protections representing investment in dreams that recent disasters couldn't entirely extinguish. Here was the next generation of Malfoy leadership, someone who would inherit not just wealth and social position, but also knowledge gained through his father's experiences about how power really worked and what prices success might demand from those brave enough to pursue it without reservation. The decade that followed Voldemort's defeat was characterized by careful reconstruction of influence and reputation through methods that demonstrated hard-won wisdom about sustainable approaches to achieving long-term objectives, rather than the dramatic confrontations and revolutionary ambitions that had characterized his Death Eater years. Lucius now pursued goals through patient accumulation of advantages, strategic relationships, and gradual expansion of influence that appeared respectable, while advancing agendas that remained fundamentally unchanged from his earlier commitments. His success in these efforts was measured not through spectacular victories, but through steady progress in positioning himself and his family for whatever opportunities future changes in magical society might create. The connections he rebuilt, the reputation he rehabilitated, and the resources he accumulated would serve as foundation for new campaigns when circumstances again favored direct action over subtle maneuvering. The man who emerged from this period of careful rebuilding was superficially different from the young Death Eater who had served Voldemort with such dedication, but essentially unchanged in his core beliefs about blood purity, natural hierarchy, and his family's destiny to lead magical society toward proper order. He had learned patience and discretion, but not humility or genuine acceptance of defeat. The cause that had defined his young adulthood was dormant rather than dead, awaiting circumstances that would allow its resurrection in forms that might prove more successful than previous incarnations. The wealth that insulated him from consequences that destroyed less fortunate Death Eaters also preserved capabilities that would serve whatever future the changing world might bring. In the quiet corridors of Malfoy Manor, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had survived their own challenges through combination of principles and pragmatism, Lucius Malfoy waited for history to provide new opportunities for old ambitions, confident that his family's time would come again when lesser souls had forgotten the lessons that temporary defeats had taught those wise enough to learn from setbacks rather than being destroyed by them. The summer heat that shimmered over Diagon Alley on that fateful August morning in 1892 seemed to amplify the tensions that had been building throughout the wizarding world. As families prepared their children for another year at Hogwarts, their shopping expeditions becoming opportunities for social positioning and political maneuvering that extended far beyond simple acquisition of school supplies. Among the crowds that thronged the cobblestone streets, two figures moved with the distinctive bearing that marked pure-blood aristocracy. Lucius Malfoy, now established as one of magical Britain's most influential citizens, despite whispered rumors about his past associations, and his 11-year-old son Draco, whose platinum hair and pointed features proclaimed his heritage to anyone familiar with the ancient bloodlines that had shaped wizarding society for centuries. The boy's first year at Hogwarts represented a milestone that filled Lucius with pride and anticipation, understanding that Draco's sorting into Slytherin House would mark the beginning of his formal education in the arts of power and influence that had sustained their family through 10 generations of political upheaval and social transformation. But more than personal satisfaction, this moment carried strategic significance as an opportunity to advance agendas that had been carefully refined during the decade of apparent rehabilitation that had followed Voldemort's defeat and his own narrow escape from Azkaban. Through wealth and connections that lesser families couldn't command, the decision to begin their shopping expedition in Nocturne Alley, rather than the more respectable establishments of the main thoroughfare, reflected practical necessities that his reformed public image couldn't entirely eliminate, as the dark artifacts collection that filled certain rooms at Malfoy Manor required discreet disposal before Arthur Weasley's increasingly aggressive raids could discover materials that might compromise the carefully constructed narrative of innocence and magical compulsion that had preserved his freedom. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest enemy within the Ministry was pursuing exactly the kind of investigation that would have been welcomed during his Death Eater years, when exposure of official corruption and pure-blood supremacist activities would have served their cause by demonstrating the system's fundamental weaknesses. Borgin and Burke's, that repository of magical items whose histories were better left unexplored, provided the discreet services that his situation required, while maintaining the kind of professional confidentiality that wealth could purchase from those whose own activities depended upon avoiding official scrutiny. The shop's proprietor, Mr. Borgin, greeted him with the deference that the Malfoy name still commanded, despite recent legal troubles, understanding that alienating such influential customers would be commercially disastrous, regardless of whatever suspicions might exist about their past or present activities. The artifacts that Lucius offered for sale represented only a fraction of the collection that centuries of Malfoy acquisitions had assembled, carefully selected items whose removal would eliminate the most obviously incriminating evidence, while preserving materials that might prove valuable in future circumstances that could reward foresight and preparation. Each piece carried its own history of dark magic and questionable provenance, testament to his family's long association with forces that respectable society preferred to ignore, while benefiting from the stability that such forces could provide when properly channeled. Young Draco's fascination with the shop's contents provided opportunities for education about realities that Hogwarts' curriculum would never address. Lessons about the thin line between acceptable magic and forbidden arts that existed primarily in legal definitions rather than practical applications. The boy's obvious intelligence and natural aristocratic bearing suggested that he would prove worthy of the advanced knowledge that his heritage made available, though Lucius was careful to emphasize the importance of discretion and proper timing in revealing such capabilities to those who might not appreciate their significance. The encounter with the Hand of Glory, that gruesome artifact whose powers Borgin explained with professional detachment, became a teaching moment about the prices that power sometimes demanded from those willing to pay them, while Draco's immediate understanding of its applications demonstrated the kind of instinctive grasp of magical principles that confirmed his worthiness to inherit everything the Malfoy name represented. But when the boy expressed interest in acquiring the item immediately, Lucius corrected him with gentle firmness that emphasized patience and strategic thinking over impulsive action. Lessons that his own experiences had taught him were essential for survival in a world where mistakes carried severe consequences. The completion of their business in Diagon Alley left him one artifact richer than when they had arrived, though not through any transaction with Borgin. The diary that Voldemort had entrusted to his care so many years ago remained in his possession despite every instinct that suggested disposing of it, along with other potentially incriminating materials, retained not from sentimental attachment but from recognition that objects of such obvious importance to his former master might someday provide opportunities that present circumstances couldn't reveal. The artifact itself appeared entirely mundane, its plain leather binding and blank pages giving no hint of the power that Voldemort had claimed it contained, or the role it might play in reopening Hogwarts' Chamber of Secrets if transported to the school through methods that couldn't be traced to their actual source. The Dark Lord's explanation of its capabilities had been characteristically brief but tantalizingly suggestive, promising consequences that would advance their cause while punishing enemies who had grown complacent during the years of apparent peace that followed his temporary defeat. The opportunity to deploy this weapon presented itself with almost magical timing as their shopping expedition moved from Nocturne Alley's shadows to Diagon Alley's more respectable establishments, where the quality of light seemed to emphasize the moral distinctions that separated pure-blood families from the blood traitors and muggle lovers who contaminated magical society through their misguided beliefs about equality and tolerance. The sight of Arthur Weasley's distinctive red hair among the crowd outside Flourish and Blots triggered immediate calculations about how this encounter might serve purposes beyond mere social confrontation. The Weasley family represented everything that Lucius had been raised to despise about the direction that magical society had taken under progressive influences. Pure-blood wizards who betrayed their heritage through association with muggles and muggle-borns. Parents who failed to provide their children with advantages that proper pride and ambition could secure. Individuals whose poverty reflected not misfortune, but fundamental character flaws that made them unfit for the responsibilities that their magical abilities theoretically qualified them to exercise. Arthur's position within the ministry, though relatively minor in terms of official authority, provided him with access to information and enforcement capabilities that made him dangerous to those whose activities required careful concealment from official scrutiny. His persistent investigations into dark artifacts and pure-blood family collections reflected not legitimate law enforcement, but personal vendetta against traditional values and established hierarchies that his egalitarian ideology compelled him to attack through whatever means his position made available. But more than professional antagonism, their conflict represented fundamental philosophical differences about magical society's proper organization and the relationships that should exist between different categories of magical beings, where Lucius saw natural hierarchy based upon blood purity and inherited superiority. Arthur perceived artificial divisions that prevented magical society from achieving its full potential through inclusive cooperation between all its members, regardless of ancestry or economic status. The confrontation that erupted outside Flourish and Blots began as verbal sparring that reflected years of accumulated resentment and ideological opposition, each man representing principles that the other found not merely wrong but actively dangerous to everything he valued most. Lucius's comments about Weasley poverty were calculated to provoke exactly the kind of emotional response that would create opportunities for physical altercation, while providing witnesses with clear evidence about which participant possessed superior self-control and aristocratic breeding. Arthur's decision to respond with violence rather than dignified withdrawal confirmed everything that Lucius believed about blood traitors and their fundamental unfitness for positions of authority within magical society, demonstrating that progressive ideologies ultimately rested upon crude emotion rather than rational principle. The physical struggle that followed was brief but intensely satisfying as an outlet for frustrations that had been accumulating throughout the decade of careful reputation, rehabilitation, that political necessity had required. But beyond personal satisfaction, the fight provided perfect cover for the strategic objective that had made this encounter truly valuable: the opportunity to plant Voldemort's diary among the Weasley family's possessions, while creating circumstances that would make its discovery by Ministry investigators impossible to trace to its actual source. The confusion and physical struggle created moments when books could be handled and returned without careful observation of their contents, while the presence of multiple witnesses ensured that official inquiries would focus upon the obvious confrontation rather than subtle manipulations that required more sophisticated analysis to detect. Ginny Weasley's school supplies, scattered during the altercation between her father and his tormentor, became the perfect vehicle for delivering the diary to Hogwarts, while ensuring that its effects would be attributed to the family that Lucius most wanted to see destroyed, rather than the pure-blood heir who had orchestrated its placement. The youngest Weasley child, innocent and trusting in ways that her parents' progressive ideology had encouraged, would serve as unwitting agent for unleashing forces that would demonstrate the consequences of challenging natural hierarchies and traditional values. The diary's placement among her textbooks was accomplished with surgical precision that years of political maneuvering had made instinctive, the artifact slipping between innocent volumes in movements too subtle for casual observers to notice, while witnesses' attention remained focused upon the dramatic confrontation between their respective parents. By the time Hagrid separated the combatants and restored superficial order to the scene, the weapon had been deployed, and its carrier was unknowingly prepared to transport it to the target where its real work could begin. Lucius's satisfaction at this successful manipulation was enhanced by recognition that even if the diary's effects were somehow traced to external influence, the investigation would naturally focus upon the Weasley family's known associations with Muggleborns and progressive elements, rather than considering involvement by someone whose reputation for reform and charitable giving had been so carefully constructed over the previous decade. The beauty of the strategy lay in its use of his enemies' own assumptions and prejudices against them, turning their certainty about his reformation into protection for activities that proved his core beliefs remained unchanged. The return to Malfoy Manor that evening found father and son reviewing the day's achievements with satisfaction that extended beyond successful completion of school shopping to encompass strategic victories that would serve their cause throughout the coming academic year. Draco's obvious excitement about beginning his formal magical education was matched by Lucius's anticipation of events that the diary's presence at Hogwarts would likely trigger, consequences that would advance agendas that patience and careful planning had made possible, despite temporary setbacks that lesser souls might have considered permanent defeats. The boy's questions about his encounter with Harry Potter provided opportunities for education about enemies whose significance extended far beyond their apparent youth and innocence. Lessons about how the boy who lived represented both symbol and reality of everything that prevented magical society from achieving its proper organization under pure-blood leadership. Potter's survival of Voldemort's killing curse had created mythology that obscured important truths about power, destiny, and the fundamental principles that governed magical conflict between superior and inferior forces. But more immediately practical were instructions about how to approach relationships with Potter and his associates, understanding that direct confrontation would be less effective than subtle manipulation, designed to isolate him from potential allies, while gathering intelligence about his capabilities and the protection that his fame provided against conventional forms of attack. The rejection that Draco had experienced during their initial meeting demonstrated Potter's susceptibility to the kind of pride and prejudice that could be exploited by those patient enough to identify appropriate vulnerabilities. The summer's end brought reports from Hogwarts that confirmed the diary's successful integration into school activities, as Ginny Weasley's possession of the artifact had apparently proceeded without detection by authorities whose attention remained focused upon more obvious forms of threat. The careful monitoring that Lucius maintained through various sources within the castle's staff and student body suggested that conditions were developing exactly as Voldemort had predicted, with the Chamber of Secrets responding to influences that its original creator had built into its fundamental magical structure. September's arrival brought news that exceeded even his most optimistic projections for how effectively the diary would serve their cause, as reports of petrified students and terrorized families created exactly the kind of crisis that could be exploited to advance multiple agendas simultaneously. The attacks upon Muggle-born students demonstrated with brutal clarity the consequences of allowing such individuals to contaminate magical institutions, while the fear that gripped the entire community created opportunities for those with sufficient influence and resources to provide leadership during periods when normal authorities proved inadequate to address extraordinary challenges. His position as school governor, carefully cultivated through charitable donations and political maneuvering during his rehabilitation years, now provided the platform necessary for translating crisis into opportunity through proposals that addressed immediate security concerns while advancing longer-term objectives that served pure-blood interests. The other governors, lacking his political sophistication and strategic vision, naturally looked to him for guidance about how to respond to developments that their limited experience hadn't prepared them to handle effectively. The proposal to remove Albus Dumbledore from his position as headmaster represented the culmination of ambitions that had been developing since his own student years, when the professor's progressive ideology and obvious power had marked him as perhaps the greatest single obstacle to achieving the kind of magical society that traditional values demanded. Dumbledore's influence over multiple generations of magical children made him uniquely dangerous to causes that required fundamental changes in how wizarding society understood itself and organized its institutions. But removing someone of Dumbledore's stature and connections required more than simple majority vote among school governors, demanding the kind of unanimous consensus that could only be achieved through methods that transcended mere persuasion to encompass more direct forms of motivation. The other governor's initial resistance to his proposal reflected not principled opposition but lack of understanding about the stakes involved and the consequences that inaction might produce for their own families and interests. The application of pressure necessary to secure their cooperation demonstrated skills that his Death Eater years had refined, but his subsequent rehabilitation had not eliminated. Understanding that effective leadership sometimes required willingness to employ methods that squeamish souls might find objectionable, but which results would ultimately validate. Each governor's signature was obtained through careful analysis of their individual vulnerabilities and precise application of incentives that made compliance seem preferable to continued resistance. The personal delivery of Dumbledore's suspension order provided satisfaction that justified years of patient preparation and strategic maneuvering, allowing him to witness firsthand the legendary wizard's response to being outmaneuvered by someone he had likely dismissed as reformed and therefore no longer dangerous. The presence of Minister Fudge and Hagrid as witnesses ensured that the humiliation would be complete, while demonstrating to the wizarding community that even its most revered figures were subject to political processes that wealth and influence could manipulate when applied with sufficient skill and determination. But the triumph that seemed so complete in that moment carried within itself the seeds of disaster that would ultimately prove more costly than any temporary victory could justify. As the diary's effects began to extend beyond his careful calculations into territories that threatened not just his enemies but potentially his own family's security, the realization that the chamber's opening had progressed to actual kidnapping rather than simple petrification suggested that forces he had unleashed were operating according to their own logic rather than his strategic objectives. Ginny Weasley's disappearance into the chamber itself represented escalation that transformed his careful manipulation into genuine crisis, with implications that extended far beyond school politics to encompass life and death. Consequences for a child whose only crime was belonging to a family he despised. The recognition that his actions had created a situation where an 11-year-old girl might die to serve his political ambitions forced confrontation with moral realities that his ideological certainties had not prepared him to address. The return of Dumbledore to Hogwarts, accomplished through governor reversals that his earlier coercion had made inevitable once circumstances changed, marked the beginning of unraveling that would strip away every advantage his careful planning had created, while exposing him to consequences that threatened everything he had worked to preserve and protect. The headmaster's knowledge about the diary's true nature and origins, demonstrated through its destroyed remains, revealed understanding that made continued deception impossible, while creating vulnerabilities that his enemies could exploit without mercy or restraint. The confrontation in Dumbledore's office became theatre of humiliation that reversed every satisfaction his earlier triumph had provided, forcing him to sit silently, while his greatest enemy praised the very family he had sought to destroy, while implicitly threatening consequences that his reformed reputation couldn't protect him from. The warning about Arthur Weasley's ability to trace dark artifacts to their sources struck at the heart of his greatest fear: discovery of activities that would reveal his claims of reformation as elaborate deception designed to avoid justice for crimes that remained unrepented and unpunished. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this defeat was its personal dimension, as Harry Potter's manipulation of his interaction with Dobby demonstrated understanding of house elf magic that transformed his own servant into weapon against him, while liberating the creature whose knowledge of family secrets made his continued bondage essential for maintaining necessary confidences. The loss of Dobby represented not just practical setback, but symbolic defeat that reduced his authority within his own household, while creating potential security risks that no amount of wealth or influence could entirely eliminate. The elf's final act of violence against his former master added physical injury to psychological humiliation, while demonstrating that even the most absolute forms of magical bondage could be overcome by those who understood the L system's underlying principles better than its supposed beneficiaries. The pain of Dobby's attack was less significant than the recognition that his own arrogance and certainty had created vulnerabilities that more careful analysis might have prevented. His slip of tongue about Harry's parents and their meddlesome nature revealed knowledge that contradicted his claims of innocence regarding Death Eater activities, providing evidence that careful interrogation could potentially develop into serious legal challenges to his freedom and reputation. The comment, spoken in anger and frustration rather than calculated strategy, demonstrated how easily emotional responses could undermine years of careful deception when circumstances created pressure that superior self-control should have been able to manage. The removal from his position as school governor, accomplished through the same unanimity that had earlier served his purposes, completed the humiliation while eliminating his most valuable source of influence within magical education system. The loss transformed him from insider with capacity to shape policy into external observer whose opinions carried no more weight than any other wealthy parent whose resources couldn't compensate for lack of institutional authority. The aftermath of the chamber incident forced recognition that his strategic miscalculation had cost him more than temporary setbacks could justify, destroying carefully constructed advantages while providing his enemies with evidence and motivation for continued scrutiny that might eventually uncover secrets that his survival required to remain hidden. The diary's failure had exposed him to risks that success might have justified while accomplishing none of the objectives that had made those risks seem acceptable. But more than immediate consequences, the episode revealed fundamental weaknesses in his approach to achieving long-term objectives through indirect manipulation rather than direct action, suggesting that patience and subtlety might be less effective than more aggressive methods when circumstances provided opportunities for decisive intervention. The lessons learned through this failure would influence his response to future crises, creating preference for approaches that provided greater control over outcomes while reducing dependence upon factors beyond his direct influence. The boy who returned from Hogwarts at year's end carried stories that confirmed his father's analysis of what had gone wrong while providing insights about Potter and his associates that would prove valuable for future planning when opportunities for renewed action presented themselves. Draco's obvious disappointment at his own limited role in events reflected ambitions that his upbringing had encouraged while demonstrating understanding that meaningful achievement required preparation and capabilities that his age and experience had not yet provided. The summer that followed became a period of reassessment and strategic recalculation, as Lucius worked to repair damage while analyzing lessons that failure had taught about the complexity of magical institutions and the dangers of underestimating opponents whose power and intelligence had been shaped by different experiences but proved no less formidable for being exercised through different methods. The diary's destruction had eliminated one weapon but not the knowledge gained through its deployment, information that future circumstances might allow him to exploit more effectively. The reputation that had taken a decade to reconstruct now required additional rehabilitation efforts that would demonstrate his continued commitment to lawful behavior while positioning him for whatever opportunities the changing political environment might create. The charitable donations that resumed their flow from Malfoy coffers served multiple purposes, rebuilding damaged relationships while establishing patterns of behavior that would support future claims of innocence should circumstances again require such defenses. The years that followed the Chamber of Secrets debacle passed with deceptive tranquility for Lucius Malfoy, each season bringing subtle reminders that his carefully constructed rehabilitation remained fragile. While the forces that had shaped wizarding society during Voldemort's absence continued to evolve in directions that his deepest convictions found increasingly intolerable. The scar upon his left arm, that permanent mark of allegiance to a cause that most believed permanently defeated, had begun to darken with changes so gradual that at first he attributed them to imagination or wishful thinking, rather than the impossible possibility that his master might be stirring from whatever realm his destruction had consigned him to. The transformation was not sudden but incremental, like sunrise emerging from the deepest night, beginning with sensations so faint that only someone who had carried the dark mark for decades could recognize their significance. The tattoo that had remained dormant since October 31st, 1881, began to pulse with rhythms that echoed his heartbeat during moments of particular stress or political frustration, as if responding to emotions that aligned with the ideology it represented. What had been lifeless ink impressed into flesh gradually acquired the characteristics of living magic, stirring with purposes that transcended mere decoration to suggest connection to forces that official wizarding society believed had been permanently extinguished. By the summer of 1894, these changes had progressed beyond subjective sensation to become objective reality that demanded acknowledgement, regardless of the implications for his carefully maintained facade of reform and respectability. The mark now responded to his thoughts and emotions with consistency that made denial impossible, darkening when he contemplated actions that served traditional pure-blood interests, while remaining quiescent during activities that his public rehabilitation required him to perform. The correlation was too precise to represent coincidence, too systematic to result from natural magical phenomena that affected cursed scars in predictable ways. But more troubling than the mark's increasing activity was his growing certainty about what these changes implied for the future of wizarding society and his own role in developments that seemed inevitable despite their apparent impossibility. If Voldemort was indeed returning from whatever condition his defeat had created, Then the years of careful reputation management and strategic patience would soon be revealed as preparation for opportunities that his public persona had never been intended to preclude. The reformed Lucius Malfoy, who donated to charitable causes and served on respectable committees, was merely camouflage for the Death Eater, who had never abandoned his core beliefs about blood purity, natural hierarchy, and the destiny that superior beings owed to themselves and their descendants. The Quidditch World Cup that summer provided perfect opportunity to test hypotheses that the Mark's behavior had been suggesting, as the gathering of international wizarding communities in one location created conditions where old alliances could be quietly renewed and future possibilities could be explored, without attracting the kind of attention that direct contact might generate. His invitation to join Minister Fudge in the top box reflected the social standing that his wealth and apparent reformation had restored. But more importantly, it provided platform for observing which other families might be experiencing similar signs of their master's potential return. The event itself unfolded with pageantry that celebrated everything magical society claimed to value: international cooperation, sporting excellence, peaceful competition between different magical traditions, while the undercurrents of tension and barely suppressed conflict revealed realities that idealistic rhetoric could never eliminate. The Irish victory over Bulgaria provided spectacle that satisfied crowds hungry for entertainment, but the real drama would come later when darkness fell, and masks could hide faces, while hoods concealed identities that daylight made too dangerous to reveal. His position in the minister's box allowed him to observe the complex social dynamics that governed interaction between families whose past associations and present circumstances created webs of obligation and suspicion that surface pleasantries could never entirely disguise. The Weasleys' presence in the same exclusive seating area provided opportunities for the kind of public civility that his reformed image required, while allowing subtle communications that those who understood the true nature of their relationship could interpret appropriately. Arthur Weasley's obvious discomfort at finding himself in such proximity to someone he correctly suspected of harboring unchanged supremacist beliefs created tension that made normal conversation impossible, while providing entertainment that helped pass time until more significant events could unfold under cover of darkness. The man's poverty and ideological commitments made him contemptible, but his position within the ministry and his persistent investigation of pureblood activities made him dangerous in ways that required careful attention rather than casual dismissal. The sight of Hermione Granger among the Weasley party triggered responses that his public persona required him to suppress, while his private convictions demanded acknowledgement, as the young witch's obvious intelligence and magical capabilities represented everything that his ideology taught him to find impossible and intolerable. That such abilities could manifest in someone whose parentage should have precluded any significant magical power challenged assumptions that his entire worldview depended upon, creating cognitive dissonance that could only be resolved through explanations that preserved essential beliefs while accounting for apparent contradictions. But personal discomfort with individual cases that seemed to contradict natural law was less significant than the gathering political storm that evening would reveal, as former Death Eaters, whose survival and freedom had been purchased through methods similar to his own, began to emerge from years of careful concealment to test possibilities that the Dark Mark's increasing activity had been suggesting. The campground that had hosted thousands of peaceful spectators during daylight hours would become theatre for demonstration of power that served multiple purposes, announcing their continued existence to enemies who had grown complacent, testing their own capabilities after years of enforced dormancy. and sending signals to those who might be prepared to answer calls that circumstances now made possible. The revival of old traditions that night represented more than nostalgic recreation of past glories, but systematic preparation for future campaigns that would benefit from renewed coordination between elements whose individual effectiveness had been limited by isolation and caution. The masks and robes that concealed individual identities while proclaiming collective allegiance created anonymity that protected participants, while demonstrating unity that years of separation had not entirely destroyed. The ritual humiliation of the Muggle family that managed the campsite served practical and symbolic purposes that justified risks inherent in such public display of power and contempt for the international statute of secrecy that supposedly governed magical society's relationship with the non-magical world. Practically, it provided opportunity to test magical capabilities and coordination that years of enforced inactivity might have diminished, while demonstrating to observers that their movement retained both power and willingness to use it against appropriate targets. Symbolically, the choice of victims and methods sent clear messages about their unchanged commitment to ideology that viewed Muggles as subhuman creatures, whose proper role was serving the convenience and pleasure of magical beings whose superior abilities made them natural masters of any environment they chose to dominate. The father suspended helplessly in air while his family was displayed for their entertainment represented perfect metaphor for relationships that their eventual victory would establish throughout the magical and non-magical worlds alike. But the appearance of the dark mark in the sky above the terrorized campground transformed what had been carefully planned demonstration into a moment of transcendent significance that validated everything they had hoped and feared about their master's potential return. The skull and serpent that blazed green against the darkness was not mere magical firework, but symbol of power that only one wizard had ever commanded, sign that their period of patient waiting might soon yield to opportunities for direct action that years of frustration had made them eager to embrace. The panic that the mark's appearance created among former enemies and neutral observers demonstrated its continuing psychological impact, even after 13 years of Voldemort's absence from active operations, proof that his influence transcended physical presence to encompass mythological dimensions that death itself had been unable to diminish. The terror that gripped auras and ministry officials revealed how completely his legend had penetrated official consciousness, despite their public dismissal of his significance and their confident assertions that his defeat had been both permanent and absolute. But for those who understood the mark's true meaning and had been prepared by their own tattoos' increasing activity to recognize signs of their master's return, its appearance represented vindication of faith that had sustained them through years of doubt and careful concealment. Here was proof that their loyalty and patience would be rewarded, that the cause they had never abandoned, despite practical necessities that required appearance of reformation, would soon provide opportunities to complete work that temporary setbacks had interrupted rather than permanently prevented. The flight that followed the mark's appearance reflected not cowardice but strategic wisdom, as remaining in proximity to such obvious magical phenomenon would inevitably attract investigation from authorities, whose questions would be difficult to answer without revealing information that their safety and effectiveness required to remain concealed. The discretion that had preserved their freedom during the years of official persecution now demanded avoiding unnecessary exposure when their master's return seemed imminent, but not yet confirmed through direct communication. The months that followed brought increasingly undeniable evidence that their hopes were being fulfilled as the dark mark upon his arm progressed from intermittent activity to consistent responsiveness that indicated strengthening connection to its original creator. The sensations that had begun as faint echoes of past magical bonding evolved into clear communications that provided guidance about preparation and positioning for events that would soon transform their careful patience into directed action serving purposes that years of apparent defeat had only refined and focused. The summons, when it finally came, arrived with force that eliminated any remaining doubt about its authenticity or significance, burning through his consciousness with power that 13 years of separation had not diminished, while commanding obedience that no amount of wealth or social position could excuse or deflect. The sensation was simultaneously familiar and transformative, reconnecting him to aspects of his identity that Reformation necessities had required him to suppress, while validating choices that critics had dismissed as youthful folly rather than mature commitment to principles that transcended individual comfort or conventional morality. The gathering place revealed through magical compulsion was appropriately dramatic for the momentous nature of the occasion. A graveyard whose ancient stones and weathered monuments provided setting that emphasized continuity between past and future, while the darkness that shrouded the assembly created atmosphere of solemnity appropriate for witnessing resurrection that challenged natural law itself. The Death Eaters, who materialized in response to the summons, represented survivors of the original movement whose persistence had earned them roles in whatever new phase of their master's campaign was about to begin. Voldemort's physical form, when he finally appeared before them, was both recognizable and transformed, carrying obvious signs of the trials that had been required for his return, while radiating power that seemed enhanced rather than diminished by whatever ordeals had restored him to active leadership of their cause. His scarlet eyes and serpentine features proclaimed his transcendence of ordinary human limitations, while his voice carried authority that years of absence had not weakened in the slightest degree. The Dark Lord's address to his assembled followers combined acknowledgement of their loyalty with analysis of failures that had led to his temporary defeat, revealing understanding of strategic errors that future campaigns would avoid while demonstrating appreciation for those who had maintained faith, despite circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. His praise for Lucius's successful maintenance of respectability and influence was accompanied by criticism of tactical mistakes that had compromised their position, creating balance between recognition and accountability that established clear expectations for future performance. The revelation of how his return had been accomplished through rituals that required Harry Potter's blood provided context for understanding both the boy's significance and the opportunities that his continued existence created for completing work that their master's first encounter with him had left unfinished. The explanation demonstrated planning and preparation that extended far beyond anything they had previously understood about his capabilities, revealing intelligence networks and loyal servants whose existence had been concealed even from his inner circle during their first campaign. But perhaps most significantly, the graveyard meeting established new hierarchies and expectations that reflected lessons learned from previous defeats, while incorporating insights gained during years of reflection and preparation that his incorporeal state had provided opportunities to develop. The movement that emerged from this resurrection would be more systematic and ruthless than its predecessor, guided by understanding of enemies and obstacles that experience had revealed, while maintaining core principles that made compromise or moderation impossible. The demonstration of power that concluded their gathering eliminated any lingering doubts about their master's capabilities, while providing glimpse of methods that future operations would employ against those foolish enough to oppose their clearly superior cause. Harry Potter's escape from what should have been his execution served as reminder that overconfidence had contributed to their previous defeat, while proving that their enemies possessed resources and luck that made cautious planning essential for ultimate success. The weeks that followed brought intensive preparation for campaigns that would test everything they had learned about magical warfare, political manipulation, and the psychology of populations whose support or neutrality their success would require. Lucius's role in these preparations drew upon both his legitimate political connections and his proven abilities in areas where official methods would be inadequate for achieving necessary objectives. His assignment to influence ministry policy through the same network of obligations and advantages that had protected him from prosecution demonstrated his master's appreciation for capabilities that years of apparent respectability had actually enhanced rather than diminished. The officials who had accepted his charity and cultivated his friendship now found themselves subject to pressure that made their previous independence impossible, while their acceptance of his generosity created moral obligations that refusal to cooperate would violate. Minister Fudge himself, whose obvious vanity and political insecurity made him particularly susceptible to the kind of manipulation that Lucius had spent decades perfecting, became primary target for influence operations, designed to prevent official recognition of Voldemort's return, while ensuring that government resources would not be deployed effectively against Death Eater activities. The minister's desperate need for validation and his preference for convenient lies over uncomfortable truths made him ideal instrument for achieving objectives that direct confrontation could never accomplish. The campaign to discredit Harry Potter and Dumbledore served multiple strategic purposes while requiring methods that Lucius's public position and apparent respectability made him uniquely qualified to execute. His contributions to various charitable causes had earned him access to influential journalists and opinion leaders whose support could be purchased or coerced depending upon their individual circumstances and vulnerabilities, creating a network of influence that could shape public opinion without revealing its actual sources or objectives. The success of these efforts exceeded even optimistic projections, as the wizarding public's preference for reassuring denial over frightening truth made them eager to embrace explanations that preserved their comfortable illusions about safety and normalcy. Potter's claims about Voldemort's return were dismissed as trauma-induced delusions or attention-seeking behavior by someone whose fame had supposedly corrupted his judgment, while Dumbledore's support for such claims was attributed to senility or political maneuvering that served personal rather than public interests. The trial of Harry Potter for unauthorized magic use represented perfect opportunity to demonstrate how thoroughly their influence had penetrated official institutions while providing platform for publicly humiliating someone whose survival continued to symbolize their master's only significant defeat. The boy's ultimate acquittal was less important than the demonstration that even the famous Harry Potter could be subjected to legal persecution when circumstances warranted such treatment, proof that fame and public sympathy provided incomplete protection against systematic application of political power. But beyond these public victories lay more sensitive operations that required capabilities and connections that his Death Eater background had uniquely provided, activities that his reformed reputation made possible, while their illegal nature demanded absolute secrecy from those whose cooperation would be essential for success. The Ministry of Magic's Department of Mysteries had always been target for intelligence operations due to its access to magical research and artifacts that could provide strategic advantages, but penetrating its security required methods that conventional espionage could never accomplish. The Imperious Curse, that unforgivable method of mental control that his legal defense had once claimed to have been victim of rather than wielder of, now became primary weapon for achieving objectives that persuasion or bribery could not secure. Sturgis Podmore, That minor order member whose capture while attempting to break into the department had been attributed to mental instability rather than external compulsion, represented successful test of techniques that more ambitious operations would require. The failure of Podmore's mission to retrieve the prophecy that concerned Harry Potter and their master revealed both the department's security capabilities and the limitations of using mentally controlled agents for operations that required initiative and problem-solving skills that the curse could not provide. The lessons learned from this failure informed subsequent attempts that employed more sophisticated approaches while maintaining plausible deniability about their actual sources and objectives. Broderick Bode's recruitment represented advancement in technique that reflected understanding gained from earlier failures, as his position within the department provided access that external agents could never achieve, while his powerful magical abilities made controlling him more challenging, but potentially more rewarding than manipulating lesser targets. The partial success of his mission before security measures activated demonstrated that their methods were improving while revealing additional obstacles that future operations would need to address. The prophecy itself, once its significance was understood through intelligence gathered from these preliminary operations, became primary objective that justified risks and resources that their master was prepared to deploy regardless of potential exposure or casualties among their forces. The revelation that it contained information about the connection between Voldemort and Harry Potter that could explain their previous encounter's unexpected outcome made its acquisition essential for planning future confrontations that would avoid the mistakes that had led to temporary defeat. The Department of Mystery's operation that finally succeeded in luring Harry Potter to the prophecy's location represented culmination of months of preparation that combined psychological manipulation with strategic deception, using the boy's known weaknesses and heroic instincts against him, while creating conditions that would allow the prophecy's retrieval without alerting authorities to their true objectives until success had been achieved. Lucius's leadership of the Death Eater team, assigned to this crucial mission, reflected his master's confidence in abilities that years of political maneuvering and strategic patience had refined, while demonstrating recognition that success would require someone whose intelligence and experience could adapt to circumstances that detailed planning could never entirely anticipate. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to restore himself to the position of trusted lieutenant that Chamber of Secrets failures had temporarily compromised. The confrontation with Potter and his young allies in the department's depths revealed both their enemy's unexpected capabilities and the limitations of relying upon prophecies for guidance about outcomes that individual choices and tactical decisions would ultimately determine. The boy's refusal to surrender the prophecy despite obvious disadvantages demonstrated courage that commanded respect, while his friend's loyalty and magical skills suggested that underestimating their opposition had contributed to previous failures that better intelligence could have prevented. But more significantly, the battle that erupted when Order members arrived to assist their young protégés proved that their enemies retained capabilities that years of apparent inactivity had not diminished, while revealing coordination and tactical sophistication that suggested preparation and training that intelligence gathering had failed to detect. The fight that followed tested every skill that decades of magical warfare had provided, while demonstrating that victory against such opponents would require resources and commitment that exceeded anything their first campaign had deployed. The prophecy's destruction, whether through accident or deliberate choice, eliminated their primary objective, while providing painful reminder that success in magical conflict required more than superior numbers and overwhelming force when opponents possessed knowledge, determination, and mutual support that made them formidable, despite obvious disadvantages in resources and experience. The orb's contents, whatever they might have revealed about connections between their master and his most persistent enemy, were lost forever, along with opportunities that such knowledge might have created. The arrival of Albus Dumbledore himself transformed tactical defeat into complete disaster, as the legendary wizard's power proved sufficient to overcome their entire force. Despite their years of preparation and superior coordination, demonstrating capabilities that neutralized every advantage they had possessed while making escape their only realistic objective. The headmaster's intervention revealed resources that their intelligence gathering had failed to identify, while proving that their enemies' apparent complacency masked preparation and vigilance that made their operations far more dangerous than careful planning had suggested. But perhaps most devastating was the public nature of their defeat and exposure, as the battle's location within the ministry itself made concealment impossible, while witness testimony would eliminate any possibility of maintaining the plausible deniability that had protected their operations for months. The careful reputation management and political positioning that had taken years to construct was destroyed in single night, along with the freedom and influence that such efforts had been designed to preserve and enhance. The capture and imprisonment that followed represented more than personal disaster, but strategic catastrophe for their entire movement, as his knowledge of operations, personnel, and methods could provide authorities with intelligence that would compromise networks and capabilities that his master's return had spent months developing. Azkaban's Dementors would ensure that such information remained secure through methods that made resistance impossible, but the damage to their cause's prospects had already been accomplished through exposure that eliminated advantages that surprise and secrecy had provided. The cell that became his home for the following year provided ample opportunity for reflection about choices and failures, while the prison's magical suppressions prevented communication with associates whose fate remained unknown but was presumably similar to his own. The isolation was complete and purposeful, designed to break spirits that official policy assumed would be vulnerable to despair once separated from the ideological support and mutual reinforcement that group membership had provided during their active phases. But the faith that sustained him through these trials was based upon understanding of their master's capabilities and determination that temporary defeats could never eliminate. Knowledge that resurrection from apparent death was possible for someone whose power transcended normal limitations, while whose commitment to their shared cause would never accept permanent failure as acceptable outcome. The dark mark that remained visible upon his arm despite prison conditions served as constant reminder that bonds forged through such magic could not be severed by mere physical confinement or official punishment. The liberation, when it finally came, arrived with suddenness that confirmed everything his faith had promised, while demonstrating that loyalty and patience were virtues that their master valued and rewarded when circumstances permitted recognition of services that had been rendered despite personal cost. The prison break that freed him and his fellow Death Eaters was conducted with precision and power that announced their movement's continued vitality, while serving notice to enemies that their apparent victory had been temporary interruption rather than permanent conclusion of conflicts that could only end with complete triumph of superior forces over inferior opposition. The fortress of Azkaban, that monument to wizarding justice and repository of magical society's most dangerous criminals, had been transformed overnight from impregnable prison to liberated stronghold through the simple expedient of its Dementors, choosing new allegiances that served their hunger more effectively than their previous obligations to ministry, authority. The creatures whose presence had made escape impossible for generations of imprisoned dark wizards now served as willing allies to the very forces they had once been employed to contain, their defection representing strategic victory that eliminated one of the most significant obstacles to Voldemort's complete restoration of power and influence. For Lucius Malfoy, the year of imprisonment that preceded his liberation had been simultaneously the most degrading experience of his privileged existence and the most profound test of faith that his commitment to their cause had ever required him to endure. The Dementor's presence had stripped away not just happiness and hope, but the very certainties about his own superiority and inevitable triumph that had sustained him through previous challenges, leaving him with nothing but core beliefs about blood purity and natural hierarchy that even soul-sucking creatures could not entirely eliminate from consciousness, shaped by decades of ideological commitment. The cell that had contained him was barely large enough for the narrow cot and basic facilities that represented the ministry's conception of appropriate accommodation for those whose crimes against wizarding society had forfeited their rights to comfort or dignity, its stone walls weeping with moisture that carried the despair of countless previous occupants whose hopes had been systematically destroyed through isolation and magical suppression. The darkness was absolute and purposeful, designed to disorient prisoners whose previous lives had been filled with luxury and control, while demonstrating their complete powerlessness against forces that their former influence could no longer affect or circumvent. But perhaps most devastating was the silence that surrounded him, broken only by occasional sounds of guards or other prisoners that served as reminders of the world beyond his cell, while emphasizing his separation from everything that had previously given his existence meaning and purpose. The political networks he had spent decades constructing, the social relationships that had provided both practical advantage and personal satisfaction, the family connections that had anchored his identity, all were severed by imprisonment that reduced him to mere number in official records, rather than name that commanded respect and fear throughout magical Britain. The knowledge that his capture had exposed operations and compromised associates created guilt that was almost worse than personal suffering, as his failure had endangered not just himself, but the broader cause that his master's return had been designed to advance through careful planning and coordinated action. The intelligence he possessed about Death Eater networks, ministry infiltration, and strategic objectives could provide authorities with information that would devastate their movement if extracted through methods that Azkaban's magical suppressions made resistance to impossible. Yet even more troubling than potential betrayal under duress was recognition that his imprisonment represented fundamental miscalculation about the risks inherent in the Department of Mystery's operation, overconfidence that had led him to accept responsibility for mission whose failure would carry consequences, extending far beyond individual punishment to encompass strategic disaster for their entire cause. The prophecy's destruction had eliminated their primary objective, while his capture had revealed capabilities and knowledge that their enemies could exploit to devastating effect against operations that his freedom had previously protected through influence and misdirection. But beneath these immediate concerns lay deeper fears about his family's fate during his enforced absence, as Narcissa and Draco would face social ostracism and potential persecution from authorities whose previous restraint had been based upon his apparent respectability and charitable contributions, rather than genuine belief in his reformation. The Malfoy name that had opened doors and commanded deference for centuries would now mark them as targets for those seeking revenge against Death Eater families whose protected status had finally been eliminated through exposure and, quote, defeat. Narcissa's letters, when prison officials occasionally permitted them to reach him, carried coded messages that revealed the deteriorating situation at Malfoy Manor, while maintaining careful language that avoided explicit discussion of illegal activities or associations that might provide additional evidence for prosecutors whose cases against captured Death Eaters required proof of continuing criminal conspiracy rather than mere historical association. Her report spoke of social isolation, financial pressures, and political persecution that transformed their previously comfortable existence into constant struggle for basic security and respect. But most heartbreaking were her carefully veiled descriptions of Draco's situation at Hogwarts, where his father's exposure as Death Eater had eliminated the social advantages that pure-blood heritage and family wealth had previously provided, while making him target for those whose hatred of Voldemort extended to anyone associated with his cause. The boy's academic performance and social relationships had suffered under pressures that his upbringing had never prepared him to handle, while his psychological state reflected confusion and resentment about circumstances that his father's choices had created, but which he was powerless to change or escape. The guilt that accompanied these revelations was more painful than any physical torture Azkaban could have devised, as recognition that his political ambitions had endangered the very family whose welfare and advancement had supposedly motivated his commitment to supremacist ideology. The comfortable certainties about duty and sacrifice that had justified dangerous choices were undermined by evidence that such choices carried costs extending far beyond their immediate perpetrators to encompass innocent victims whose only crime was loving those whose convictions had made moderation and compromise impossible. Yet beneath guilt and regret lay anger that grew with each month of imprisonment, rage directed not at his own choices, but at the system that punished loyalty to principles while rewarding those who betrayed their heritage and responsibilities through collaboration with forces that sought to destroy everything pure-blood families represented. Arthur Weasley's success in maintaining respectability, despite his blood traitorous beliefs, served as constant reminder of how thoroughly magical society had been corrupted by progressive ideology that placed equality above excellence and tolerance above truth. The irony was inescapable and bitter. He was imprisoned for serving cause that sought to restore natural order to magical society, while those who actively worked to undermine that order enjoyed freedom and influence that their treachery should have forfeited. The moral inversion that this represented confirmed everything he had believed about the need for radical change in wizarding civilization, while his punishment demonstrated the lengths to which corrupt systems would go to preserve their power against those brave enough to challenge their fundamental assumptions and illegitimate authority. His fellow prisoners, those Death Eaters whose capture had accompanied his own, provided both companionship and frustration during the long months when communication was possible despite official restrictions designed to prevent coordination or mutual support among those whose shared ideology made them inherently dangerous to proper prison discipline. Their conversations, conducted through magical methods that guards couldn't entirely prevent, revealed the scope of damage that their collective failure had inflicted upon their movement, while confirming that their commitment remained unshaken, despite circumstances that might have broken lesser souls. Bellatrix Lestrange, whose fanatical devotion to their master exceeded even his own, served as constant reminder of what absolute loyalty demanded from those who truly understood the significance of their cause and the sacrifices that serving it might require. Her willingness to endure any suffering rather than compromise her beliefs provided inspiration during moments when doubt threatened to undermine resolve that imprisonment was systematically designed to destroy through isolation and despair. The Lestrange brothers, whose coordination and mutual support demonstrated the advantages that family connections could provide, even in circumstances designed to eliminate such bonds, offered models for maintaining identity and purpose. Despite pressures that sought to reduce prisoners to broken individuals, whose previous lives became irrelevant to their current existence. Their ability to preserve dignity and determination while subjected to conditions that made both nearly impossible proved that superior breeding and proper education created resources that external circumstances could never entirely eliminate. But perhaps most significant was the knowledge, shared through whispered communications and coded messages, that their imprisonment was temporary condition rather than permanent fate. As their master's power continued to grow, despite setbacks that enemies mistakenly interpreted as decisive victories, the dark mark's continued presence upon their arms served as constant reminder that bonds forged through such magic transcended physical separation, while providing assurance that loyalty would eventually be rewarded when circumstances permitted recognition and liberation. The signs of Voldemort's increasing influence were subtle but unmistakable to those who understood his methods and capabilities, manifesting through events that official sources attributed to random violence or criminal activity, but which revealed patterns that careful analysis could identify as systematic campaign designed to destabilize Ministry authority, while preparing conditions for more direct action. The Dementors' growing restlessness, the unexplained disappearances of Ministry officials, the increasing frequency of dark magic incidents, all pointed toward coordination that only their master could provide. When the liberation finally came, it arrived with suddenness that caught even prepared prisoners by surprise, as the fortress that had contained them for months was transformed in minutes from impregnable prison to staging area for operations that would demonstrate their movement's continued vitality, while announcing to magical Britain that reports of their defeat had been premature and overly optimistic. The Dementors, who had been their jailers, became their allies through negotiations that only Voldemort could have conducted, his understanding of their nature and needs creating alliance that eliminated one of the most significant obstacles to his complete restoration. The escape was conducted with precision that revealed extensive planning and intelligence gathering, as every aspect of Azkaban's security had been analyzed and countered through methods that demonstrated capabilities extending far beyond what their enemies had attributed to scattered Death Eater remnants. The coordination required for simultaneous operations at multiple locations while maintaining security that prevented Ministry interference proved that their organization had not been destroyed by previous defeats, but had evolved into something more dangerous and effective. But the freedom that seemed like salvation quickly revealed itself as entrance into circumstances far more challenging and dangerous than imprisonment had ever been. As Lucius found himself returning not to the comfortable existence that his wealth and influence had previously secured, but to a world where his master's presence dominated every aspect of daily life, while his own status had been fundamentally altered by failures that could not be forgotten or entirely forgiven. Malfoy Manor, the ancestral home that had been refuge and symbol of family achievement for 10 centuries, was now headquarters for Death Eater operations that transformed private residence into military installation, where personal considerations were subordinate to strategic necessities. The transformation was immediately apparent as he approached the familiar gates that had once marked the boundary between public obligations and private sanctuary, their elegant ironwork now supplemented by wards and protective enchantments that spoke of preparation for siege rather than maintenance of social distinction. The peacocks that had roamed the grounds as symbols of exotic luxury were gone, replaced by creatures whose loyalty could be assured and whose capabilities served defensive rather than decorative purposes. The interior of the manor reflected even more dramatic changes, as rooms that had been designed for entertaining pure-blood society were converted to serve functions that their original architects had never imagined. Strategic planning centers, communication hubs, interrogation facilities, and armories that stored weapons both magical and mundane. The dining room where he had hosted elegant dinner parties now accommodated conferences where life and death decisions were made with casual efficiency, while the drawing room that had displayed centuries of accumulated art and artifacts was stripped to bare essentials that provided no distractions from serious discussion of war and politics. But most shocking was the sight of Voldemort himself occupying the head of the table where Malfoy patriarchs had presided over family gatherings for generations, his presence transforming what had been private space into public arena, where personal relationships were subordinate to hierarchies based upon service and results, rather than birth and breeding. The Dark Lord's serpentine features and scarlet eyes seemed alien in surroundings that had been designed for human comfort, while his voice carried undertones of command that made protest or disagreement impossible regardless of property ownership or family tradition. The meeting that followed his return demonstrated how completely his status had changed during the year of imprisonment, as Voldemort's address focused upon failures and their consequences rather than welcome and restored partnership. The loss of the prophecy was analyzed in detail that revealed every tactical mistake and strategic miscalculation, while his capture was examined as evidence of carelessness that had endangered operations extending far beyond the single mission that had resulted in disaster. But perhaps most devastating was the casual dismissal of his previous importance to their cause, as the Dark Lord made clear that 12 years of loyal service could not compensate for recent failures that had compromised their position while providing enemies with advantages that careful planning had sought to prevent. The political connections that had once made him invaluable were now liabilities that attracted unwanted attention, while his social position had been destroyed through exposure that eliminated his capacity for the kind of subtle influence that had previously served their interests. The wand that Voldemort demanded as token of his continued service represented ultimate symbol of his reduced status, as the instrument that had been crafted specifically for his magical signature and had served him throughout his adult career was claimed by someone whose power made such gestures of submission necessary for continued existence within the power organization. The humiliation was complete and intentional, demonstrating to other Death Eaters that even the most trusted lieutenants were expendable when their usefulness had been compromised through failure or exposure. His attempt to reach for Voldemort's wand in exchange revealed how completely he had misunderstood the nature of their current relationship, as the laughter that greeted this gesture made clear that he was supplicant rather than partner, servant whose continued value remained to be proven, rather than ally, whose contributions were recognized and appreciated. The magical bond that had connected him to his wand for decades was severed with casual efficiency that left him feeling diminished and vulnerable, dependent upon his master's goodwill for even basic magical capabilities that his education and training should have guaranteed regardless of political circumstances. The question about his family's happiness with their current situation was delivered with tone that made clear that the correct answer was enthusiastic endorsement, regardless of actual feelings, as any suggestion of reluctance or dissatisfaction would be interpreted as disloyalty that required correction through methods that he preferred not to imagine. The forced nod of agreement that he provided, along with Narcissa and Draco, represented complete capitulation to authority that brooked no resistance, while demonstrating how thoroughly their lives had been subordinated to purposes that their personal preferences were irrelevant to determining. Narcissa's obvious distress at their situation was carefully concealed but visible to someone who had shared her life for decades. Her aristocratic composure, maintaining surface calm, while her eyes revealed fears about their family's future that circumstances made it impossible to discuss openly. The woman who had been partner in building their dynasty was now reduced to silent observer of its destruction, her opinions and concerns irrelevant to decisions that would determine whether her husband and son survived the conflicts that his choices had made inevitable. But most heartbreaking was Draco's confusion and terror as he witnessed his father's humiliation, while trying to understand how the man who had represented strength and success throughout his childhood could be reduced to begging for acceptance from someone whose presence filled their home with darkness and danger. The boy's education in pure-blood superiority had not prepared him for situations where such superiority was claimed by others whose power made resistance futile, while his love for his father created loyalty conflicts that his age and experience couldn't resolve. The months that followed brought systematic erosion of everything that had made their lives meaningful, while they were forced to maintain facades of gratitude and cooperation that made honest communication about their situation impossible, even within their own family. Bellatrix's presence as overseer ensured that privacy was eliminated, while her fanatical loyalty to Voldemort made her reliable agent for detecting and reporting any signs of insufficient enthusiasm or hidden resentment that might indicate disloyalty requiring correction. The dinner parties that had once celebrated their social prominence were replaced by Death Eater gatherings where strategy was discussed and assignments were distributed, their elegant dining room becoming venue for planning operations that would advance their cause regardless of civilian casualties or collateral damage that such activities might create. The conversations that filled their home concerned torture and murder rather than politics and society, while the laughter that echoed through their corridors was triggered by descriptions of suffering inflicted upon those whose only crime was opposing their ideology or protecting their targets. His own role in these gatherings was carefully circumscribed by his reduced status and questionable reliability, as his previous failures made him unsuitable for sensitive missions, while his continued residence in the manor that served as headquarters created security risks that required constant surveillance and periodic testing of his loyalty. The assignments he received were deliberately mundane and closely supervised, designed to demonstrate his continued utility, while ensuring that any remaining treacherous impulses would be detected before they could compromise more important operations. The torture sessions that were conducted in his own dungeons represented perhaps the most visceral demonstration of how completely his authority had been usurped, as spaces that had been designed for wine storage and household supplies were converted to interrogation facilities, where screams of pain echoed through corridors that had previously known only servants' quiet efficiency. The knowledge that such activities were taking place beneath his own home while he was powerless to prevent them created psychological torment that was arguably worse than any physical suffering his enemies might have devised. But the systematic destruction of his political network, through targeted elimination of ministry officials who had accepted his charity or provided him with information, proved that his master understood exactly how to inflict maximum damage upon someone whose entire adult identity had been built around influence and connection. Each death removed another strand from the web of relationships that had sustained his power, while sending clear messages to surviving contacts that association with him had become liability rather than advantage. The manor's transformation from private residence to military headquarters was completed through modifications that eliminated every trace of comfort or beauty that might distract from serious business of planning and conducting operations against enemies whose resistance was becoming increasingly organized and effective. The art collections were removed or destroyed. The furnishings were replaced with functional equipment, and the magical protections were enhanced to serve defensive rather than decorative purposes. His family's adaptation to these changed circumstances revealed character traits that prosperity and security had never required them to develop, as Narcissa demonstrated resilience and dignity that made their reduced situation bearable, while Draco began to understand realities about power and consequence that his privileged upbringing had protected him from recognizing. The love that bound them together proved stronger than the circumstances that threatened to destroy them, creating an oasis of genuine human connection within an environment dominated by ideology and violence. Yet even as they struggled to maintain family bonds under impossible conditions, external pressures continued to mount as their master's campaign against ministry authority created responses that made their position increasingly precarious. The Order of the Phoenix's renewed activities threatened operations, while their own reduced capability for intelligence gathering made planning effective countermeasures difficult when information about enemy capabilities and intentions was limited by his compromised position within networks that had previously provided reliable intelligence. The knowledge that Harry Potter remained free and active, despite multiple attempts to eliminate him, served as constant reminder of failures that had initiated their current difficulties, while suggesting that their enemies possessed resources and protection that conventional methods could not overcome. The boys' continued survival represented not just tactical setback but symbolic challenge to their master's authority that made resolution essential regardless of costs that such efforts might require. The preparations for what everyone understood would be final confrontation with forces that had opposed them for too long consumed resources and attention that their reduced circumstances made difficult to sustain while creating pressure for decisive action that might not be advisable given their current strategic position. The desperation that was beginning to characterize their planning reflected recognition that time was working against them, while their enemies grew stronger through alliance and coordination that their own internal divisions made difficult to counter effectively. Yet beneath all these immediate concerns lay deeper recognition that the path he had chosen years ago when joining Voldemort's cause was leading inevitably toward outcomes that would destroy everything he had claimed to be fighting to preserve. While the ideology that had sustained him through previous challenges was proving inadequate for circumstances that demanded choices between principles and survival, between loyalty and family, between past commitments and future possibilities that his previous certainties had not prepared him to navigate successfully. The revelation that shattered the last vestiges of Lucius Malfoy's faith in his master's invincibility arrived not through dramatic battlefield defeat or public humiliation, but through the quiet horror of understanding what Voldemort had done to his own soul in pursuit of immortality and power. The discovery of Horcruxes, objects containing fragments of the Dark Lord's essence that anchored him to life through the most abhorrent magic imaginable, transformed every certainty about their cause and its ultimate meaning, while revealing the true price that such dedication demanded from those who served leaders whose ambitions extended beyond mortal limitations into realms where humanity itself became obstacle to be overcome. The diary that had cost him his position as school governor and exposed him to years of suspicion was revealed as one of these cursed artifacts. Its destruction, explaining why Voldemort had been so enraged by what Lucius had considered minor tactical setback, rather than catastrophic loss of irreplaceable magical item. The realization that his careless deployment of such an object had resulted in permanent damage to his master's soul created guilt that transcended professional failure to encompass responsibility for spiritual mutilation that no amount of subsequent loyalty could repair or justify. But more devastating than personal culpability was recognition that the ideology he had served with such dedication was merely facade concealing agenda that made the supremacist beliefs that had shaped his identity since childhood seem irrelevant to purposes that transcended questions of blood, purity, or magical hierarchy. Voldemort's true goal was not restoration of pure-blood dominance, but achievement of personal immortality through methods that reduced all other considerations to instruments serving his individual quest for power that acknowledged no limitations and respected no boundaries. The theft from Gringotts Bank that resulted in the destruction of another Horcrux demonstrated how completely their strategic position had deteriorated, while revealing capabilities among their enemies that intelligence gathering had failed to detect or properly evaluate. Harry Potter's successful penetration of the most secure magical institution in Britain, accomplished with assistance that suggested coordination and resources exceeding anything previous operations had encountered, proved that underestimating their opposition had become potentially fatal error that could no longer be attributed to inexperience or overconfidence. The rage that consumed Voldemort upon learning of this loss transcended anything Lucius had witnessed during years of service, revealing aspects of their master's personality that his controlled public demeanor had previously concealed, while demonstrating emotional instability that made rational strategic planning impossible when personal concerns overrode tactical considerations. The Dark Lord's response to crisis was not calculated adaptation, but explosive fury that created dangers for his own followers, while providing opportunities for enemies whose psychological warfare was proving more effective than conventional military opposition. The meeting where this catastrophic news was delivered became exercise in survival as those present recognized that their master's wrath required targets, while his deteriorating mental state made logical analysis of responsibility impossible. The scramble toward exits as bodies began falling demonstrated that even Inner Circle Death Eaters understood their expendability. When Voldemort's frustrations demanded expression through violence that served emotional rather than strategic purposes, his narrow escape from that gathering marked a turning point in his understanding of what their association had become, as the arbitrary nature of who lived and who died revealed that loyalty and service provided no protection against Master, whose psychological condition made him as dangerous to followers as to enemies. The fear that gripped him as he fled Malfoy Manor's Great Hall was not cowardice, but recognition that continued survival required reassessment of priorities that had sustained him through decades of political maneuvering and ideological commitment. The conversation with Narcissa that followed confirmed what his own instincts had been suggesting, that their family's welfare had become secondary to causes and personalities whose demands were consuming everything they had worked to preserve, while offering nothing in return except continued servitude to someone whose sanity was deteriorating with each setback. Her tears, shed in private moments when surveillance was briefly relaxed, reflected understanding that their son's future was being sacrificed to serve agenda that no longer bore any relationship to values they had claimed to represent. Draco's situation at Hogwarts during his 7th year created additional pressure that made neutrality impossible, while demonstrating how completely their circumstances had deteriorated since his early years as respected, pure-blood heir, whose future seemed limitless. The boy's assignment to kill Dumbledore was both impossible task and death sentence, designed to punish Lucius for his failures, while eliminating family member whose survival might create complications for future operations that required absolute loyalty from those who remained useful. The knowledge that his son was being used as expendable weapon against target, whose elimination served Voldemort's personal vendetta rather than strategic objectives, created psychological torment that exceeded any physical suffering Azkaban had inflicted, as parental love confronted ideological commitment in ways that made continued self-deception impossible. Every letter from Narcissa brought updates about Draco's deteriorating condition, while confirming that their master viewed the boy's likely death as acceptable cost for achieving goals that family considerations were not permitted to influence. The miracle of Draco's survival through the school year owed nothing to Voldemort's mercy and everything to Severus Snape's intervention, as the potions master's completion of the assassination mission demonstrated capabilities and loyalties that transcended simple Death Eater service, while revealing networks of obligation and protection that existed parallel to official organizational structures. But even this reprieve created new dangers, as their master's suspicions about failure and potential treachery made everyone associated with the operation subject to scrutiny that could prove fatal, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. The Battle of Hogwarts began for the Malfoy family not as opportunity for glorious victory, but as desperate search for their son, amid chaos that had consumed the school where 3 generations of their family had received their magical education. The ancient castle that had once represented stability and tradition was transformed into battlefield where everything they had claimed to value was being destroyed through conflict that served no comprehensible purpose beyond settling personal scores that had nothing to do with blood, purity, or magical hierarchy. Lucius's participation in the assault was motivated not by commitment to their cause, but by desperate need to locate Draco before the battle's outcome eliminated any possibility of family reunion, while Narcissa's presence reflected similar priorities that made ideological considerations irrelevant compared to maternal instincts that transcended political loyalty. Their searching through corridors filled with combatants revealed how completely their perspective had changed, from supporters of revolutionary cause to parents whose only concern was protecting their child from consequences of choices they could no longer defend or justify. The encounter with Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest, where Harry Potter's apparent death was confirmed through methods that demonstrated their master's continuing power, while revealing his psychological deterioration through casual cruelty that served no tactical purpose, provided final demonstration of what their association had become. The Dark Lord's treatment of supposed allies, with same contempt he showed for enemies, eliminated any remaining illusions about mutual respect or shared objectives that might make continued service worthwhile. But it was Narcissa's lie about Potter's condition that marked their family's definitive break with the cause that had dominated their lives for so many years, as her deception in service of maternal love represented choice between ideology and family that circumstances had finally forced upon them. Her willingness to betray Voldemort to protect her son demonstrated courage that his own commitment to abstract principles had never required, while proving that authentic values sometimes demanded abandonment of everything that had previously defined identity and purpose. The return to Hogwarts carrying what everyone believed was Potter's corpse created atmosphere of triumph that felt hollow and temporary to those who understood that victory achieved through such methods could never provide foundation for stable society, while the celebration that erupted among Death Eater ranks revealed bloodlust and sadism that made their supremacist ideology seem like intellectual exercise compared to realities of what their movement had become through years of violence and moral compromise. The battle's resumption, when Neville Longbottom's destruction of Nagini revealed Potter's survival, transformed apparent victory into chaos that eliminated every strategic advantage their forces had possessed, while demonstrating that their enemy's resources extended beyond anything intelligence gathering had identified. The snake's death marked destruction of final Horcrux that maintained Voldemort's immortality, though this significance was understood only by those who possessed knowledge about magical techniques that most Death Eaters had never been permitted to learn. His desperate search for Draco, amid renewed fighting, reflected priorities that had nothing to do with battle outcomes or political objectives, as recognition that his son's safety mattered more than any cause made continued participation in combat meaningless, except as means of protecting family member whose welfare had become his only remaining concern. Narcissa's similar focus on locating their child rather than supporting military operations confirmed that their transformation from ideological supporters to protective parents was complete and irreversible. The moment when they finally located Draco alive amid the castle's destruction provided relief that transcended anything political victory could have offered, while their immediate withdrawal from active combat demonstrated understanding that family preservation required abandonment of loyalties that had once seemed more important than personal relationships. The embrace that united them in corner of Great Hall where wounded and exhausted fighters rested between engagements marked symbolic end of their involvement in conflicts that had consumed their lives while providing nothing in return, except suffering and loss. Harry Potter's final confrontation with Voldemort unfolded before assembled survivors whose allegiances had become irrelevant to outcome that would be determined by forces and choices extending far beyond simple military superiority, as magical protections and ancient bonds revealed themselves to be more powerful than conventional weapons or tactical advantages. The duel that concluded with the Dark Lord's permanent destruction eliminated not just individual enemy, but entire worldview that had shaped Wizarding Society's development for decades. The silence that followed Voldemort's death was more profound than mere absence of sound, encompassing recognition that era of conflict and ideology was ending while future would require reconstruction of institutions and relationships that warfare had damaged beyond easy repair. For the Malfoy family, huddled together among survivors whose previous enmities now seemed irrelevant compared to shared relief at having endured trials that had tested everyone's fundamental beliefs about right and wrong. Their presence in the Great Hall, among those who celebrated victory over cause they had once served, created awkwardness that reflected complexity of situation, where former enemies would need to find ways of coexistence that transcended previous conflicts, while acknowledging harm that had been inflicted by all sides during years of escalating violence. The uncertainty about their fate was matched by confusion about whether they belonged among those whose triumph they had not supported, but whose values they could no longer oppose. The gradual recognition that they would not be immediately arrested or executed for their association with defeated cause provided opportunity for contemplation about choices that had brought them to this point, while considering possibilities for future that would require fundamental reassessment of everything they had believed about power, loyalty, and the obligations that family relationships created. The freedom to remain in castle while official investigations and legal proceedings were organized suggested that their late defection had been noted and would influence whatever justice awaited those who had served Voldemort's regime. But more than legal consequences, they faced psychological challenge of reconstructing identities that had been built around ideology that events had proven both false and destructive, while maintaining family relationships that had survived tests that might have broken weaker bonds but had ultimately demonstrated their fundamental importance compared to abstract principles that had nearly cost them everything they actually valued. The love that had sustained them through their darkest period would now need to provide foundation for rebuilding lives that would necessarily be very different from anything their previous existence had prepared them to imagine. The dawn that broke over Hogwarts the morning after Voldemort's defeat, illuminated landscape transformed not just by physical destruction, but by elimination of certainties that had governed wizarding society for generations, creating opportunities for those wise enough to adapt, while punishing those who remained committed to beliefs that events had made obsolete. For the Malfoy family, sitting together in empty corridor where wounded had been treated and exhausted fighters had found brief rest, the sunrise represented both ending and beginning, conclusion of chapter in their lives that had brought them nothing but suffering, and commencement of period where their choices might finally serve purposes they could actually defend and embrace. The knowledge that they had survived when others had not created obligations that extended beyond simple gratitude to encompass responsibility for using their remaining resources and capabilities in service of reconstruction rather than continued conflict. While their experience with both sides of ideological divide provided unique perspective on costs of extremism that might help prevent future generations from making similar mistakes. The path ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs to choose, rather than direction imposed by those whose vision had proven so catastrophically wrong about fundamental questions of value and meaning. The months that followed Voldemort's final defeat brought a reckoning that extended far beyond simple legal proceedings to encompass fundamental questions about justice, redemption, and the possibility of meaningful change in those whose choices had caused immeasurable suffering throughout the wizarding world. For the Malfoy family, huddled together in the ruins of their former prominence while magical Britain struggled to rebuild institutions and relationships that years of warfare had damaged beyond easy repair, survival itself had become achievement that required constant negotiation with authorities whose desire for vengeance was tempered only by practical considerations about the costs of comprehensive punishment for everyone who had served the placed Dark Lord's regime. The trials that determined the fate of captured Death Eaters proceeded with deliberation that reflected both the magnitude of crimes committed and the complexity of circumstances that had led ordinary wizards to embrace ideology so destructive that its ultimate consequences had threatened the very survival of magical civilization itself. The courtrooms that witnessed these proceedings became theaters where individual responsibility intersected with collective guilt, where personal choices were examined against backdrop of social pressures and political manipulation that made simple judgments about right and wrong almost impossible to sustain under scrutiny, that revealed the intricate web of coercion, conviction, and compromise that had characterized life under Voldemort's influence. For Lucius, the prospect of facing the Wizengamot as defendant, rather than influential observer, represented ultimate reversal of fortune that his wealth and connections had previously made unthinkable, while the evidence that would be presented against him encompassed decades of activities that his careful legal defenses following Voldemort's first defeat had claimed were performed under magical compulsion rather than voluntary choice. The imperious curse defense that had preserved his freedom after 1881 would be far more difficult to sustain when testimony from fellow Death Eaters and recovered documents provided detailed evidence of planning and coordination that suggested conscious participation rather than unwilling compliance with external control. But the proceedings that everyone expected never materialized, as circumstances that had seemed to demand comprehensive justice for all who had served the Dark Lord's cause, were complicated by practical considerations that made selective prosecution more appealing than systematic punishment that might have created more problems than it solved for society, attempting to heal divisions that total war had created. The Malfoy family's late defection from Voldemort's ranks, symbolized by Narcissa's crucial deception about Harry Potter's condition during the battle's climactic moments, provided legal foundation for clemency that their previous wealth and influence alone could never have secured. The recognition that her lie had been instrumental in preserving the life of the wizard whose survival had enabled their master's final defeat created moral complexity that made simple punishment seem inadequate response to situation where former enemies had played essential roles in achieving victory that their official allegiances should have prevented them from supporting. The legal precedent established by treating such last-minute conversions as mitigating factors rather than desperate attempts to avoid consequences set standard that would influence how post-war justice was administered to those whose loyalty had proven less absolute than their rhetoric had suggested. The negotiations that secured their freedom were conducted through intermediaries whose discretion protected all parties from public scrutiny, while allowing arrangements that served multiple interests simultaneously. The ministry's need to demonstrate magnanimity toward those who had ultimately chosen correctly. The Malfoy family's requirement for security and social rehabilitation, and magical society's desire to avoid prolonged legal proceedings that might have reopened wounds that healing required to remain closed. The agreement that emerged from these discussions reflected pragmatic recognition that perfect justice was less important than functional peace. The price of their freedom was not merely legal but social, as the reputation that had taken centuries to build was permanently altered in ways that no amount of wealth or charitable giving could entirely repair, while the networks of relationship and influence that had sustained their prominence were severed by associations that former allies could no longer afford to maintain. The Malfoy name would remain recognizable throughout magical Britain, but its significance had been transformed from symbol of aristocratic excellence to reminder of how thoroughly ideology could corrupt even those whose breeding and education should have provided protection against such extremism. Yet even as they accepted these consequences, the family began to understand that their survival represented opportunity as much as punishment, chance to rebuild their lives according to values that their recent experiences had revealed to be more important than the supremacist beliefs that had nearly destroyed everything they actually cared about. The love that had sustained them through their darkest period would now provide foundation for creating identity that drew meaning from authentic relationships rather than inherited prejudices, while their resources could serve purposes that enhanced rather than diminished the welfare of magical society as whole. The evidence they provided against fellow Death Eaters who had not shared their change of heart served multiple functions, demonstrating their commitment to cooperation with authorities, while helping to ensure that those whose dedication to Voldemort's cause remained unshaken would face appropriate consequences for crimes that mercy could not excuse, even when political considerations might suggest moderation. The intelligence networks that Lucius had developed during his years of ministry influence now served justice rather than serving those who would subvert it, while his understanding of Death Eater organization and methods provided insights that helped investigators piece together the full scope of activities that had been conducted under cover of official respectability. But perhaps most significantly, their cooperation represented genuine repudiation of ideology that had shaped their choices for so many years. Acknowledgement that the beliefs about blood purity and natural hierarchy that had seemed so reasonable and necessary were actually forms of moral blindness that had prevented them from recognizing the humanity of those they had dismissed as inferior. The process of providing testimony that would help convict former associates forced confrontation with realities about their own past behavior that comfortable self-deception had previously obscured. The social rehabilitation that followed their legal exoneration was far more challenging than any court proceedings could have been, as acceptance back into respectable wizarding society required not just official forgiveness, but genuine transformation of attitudes and behaviors that had been integral to their identity for generations. The charitable donations and public service that had once been calculated investments in reputation now became expressions of authentic commitment to values that their experiences had taught them to embrace, while their interactions with those they had previously dismissed revealed capabilities and character that their prejudices had made invisible. The most difficult aspect of this transformation was acknowledging the extent to which their supremacist beliefs had been not just mistaken but actively harmful to themselves as well as those they had targeted, as recognition that their ideology had prevented them from developing authentic relationships with anyone outside their narrow social circle, had created isolation and emotional poverty that wealth could never address. The rigid categories that had governed their understanding of worth and value had made genuine human connection impossible, even with those who shared their background and beliefs. Draco's adjustment to post-war reality proved particularly challenging, as the young man struggled to reconcile the values his upbringing had emphasized with evidence that such values had led his family to the brink of destruction, while causing immeasurable harm to those whose only crime had been existing outside the narrow boundaries that pure-blood ideology considered acceptable. His education at Hogwarts had provided some exposure to alternative perspectives, but the systematic indoctrination he had received throughout his childhood required conscious effort to overcome through relationships and experiences that challenged every assumption about superiority and entitlement that his privilege had encouraged. The friendship he tentatively developed with former enemies like Harry Potter represented not just personal growth but symbolic healing of divisions that had seemed permanent and irreconcilable, while his romantic interest in Astoria Greengrass demonstrated evolution beyond the rigid categories that had previously determined appropriate social connections. Her family's pure-blood heritage satisfied traditional expectations, while her progressive attitudes about magical society's proper organization provided influence that gradually reshaped his understanding of what their shared background could contribute to rather than what it entitled them to claim. The wedding between Draco and Astoria was conducted with ceremony appropriate to their family's status, while reflecting values that emphasized service to community rather than maintenance of superiority, as the young couple's vows included commitments to using their resources and capabilities for purposes that would benefit magical society rather than merely preserving their own advantages. The guest list included representatives from families across the spectrum of blood status and political affiliation, creating gathering that would have been unthinkable during the years when supremacist ideology governed such decisions. But even this celebration carried undertones of loss and regret, as Lucius and Narcissa's obvious happiness at their son's marriage was complicated by understanding of how different their lives might have been if wisdom had come earlier and at less terrible cost to themselves and others. The knowledge that their grandson would grow up in a world where blood purity was no longer considered a meaningful category for determining worth or opportunity provided satisfaction that partially compensated for recognition of time and relationships that their previous beliefs had wasted through unnecessary prejudice and artificial division. Scorpius Malfoy's birth represented not just continuation of family line, but symbolic renewal of possibilities that redemption could create, when genuine change replaced superficial reform, as the child would inherit wealth and position without the ideological baggage that had corrupted previous generations' understanding of what such advantages were meant to accomplish. His upbringing would emphasize responsibility rather than entitlement, service rather than superiority, while his magical education would include exposure to diversity of perspectives that his father and grandfather had been denied through educational systems designed to preserve rather than challenge inherited assumptions. The boy's friendship with Albus Potter, son of the wizard whose survival had enabled Voldemort's defeat, created relationships that transcended historical animosities while demonstrating possibilities for cooperation that previous generations had been too blinded by prejudice to recognize or pursue. The casual ease with which the children interacted across family lines that had once seemed unbridgeable provided daily evidence of how artificial such divisions had always been, while their shared adventures and mutual support proved that meaningful connections required nothing more than openness to recognizing worth in those whose backgrounds differed from one's own. Yet even as the family celebrated these positive developments, they continued to grapple with consequences of choices that forgiveness could ameliorate but never entirely erase, as the social stigma attached to their name created barriers that affected career prospects, business relationships, and personal interactions in ways that wealth alone could not overcome. The comfortable certainty of their previous social position had been replaced by constant awareness that acceptance remained conditional upon continued demonstration of reformed attitudes and authentic commitment to values that their past behavior had suggested they rejected. The magical artifacts that continued to fascinate Lucius despite everything he had learned about the dangers of pursuing power without wisdom reflected both persistent curiosity about magical principles and recognition that understanding such objects might help prevent others from making similar mistakes about what knowledge and capability were meant to serve. His collection now emphasized educational rather than practical value, while his research focused on protection and healing rather than domination and control, though critics suggested that such interest revealed unchanged obsession with power that merely expressed itself through different methods. The Time Turner incident that some sources attribute to his involvement during these later years demonstrated that complete transformation of character was perhaps impossible for someone whose entire identity had been shaped by pursuit of advantage and control, while the consequences of such meddling with temporal mechanics provided harsh reminder that some forms of knowledge carried risks that even reformed intentions could not eliminate. The complications that resulted from attempts to alter historical outcomes served as cautionary tale about limits of redemption and persistent temptations that wealth and capability created even for those whose experiences should have taught them better. But more than individual failings, such incidents revealed broader challenges that magical society faced in integrating former enemies whose resources and capabilities remained potentially dangerous, even when their motivations had ostensibly changed. While the precedent established by their clemency created expectations among other reformed Death Eaters that similar mercy would be available to those whose conversions might prove less authentic or permanent than circumstances had, encouraged officials to assume the death that would eventually claim Lucius remained uncertain in official records, though speculation about his fate reflected persistent public fascination with those whose dramatic falls from grace had provided cautionary lessons about costs of extremism, while their subsequent rehabilitation had demonstrated possibilities for redemption that few had believed possible during the dark years of Voldemort's regime. The absence of definitive information about his final years allowed various interpretations of his legacy to persist among those whose own experiences with prejudice and change influenced their assessment of what his transformation had meant, and whether such change could be considered authentic, given the terrible costs that his previous choices had imposed upon magical society. The estate he left to his descendants reflected both the diminished circumstances that his political choices had created and the resources that careful management during his rehabilitation years had preserved for future generations. While the charitable bequests that distributed significant portions of the Malfoy fortune to causes serving Muggle-born wizards and other marginalized communities provided final statement about values that his experiences had taught him to embrace. The foundation established in his name would continue supporting educational initiatives and healing programs that addressed damage caused by supremacist ideology while working to prevent future generations from developing similar prejudices. The memoir that Draco eventually published about his family's experiences during the war years provided insight into psychological processes that could transform apparently decent people into supporters of genocidal ideology while demonstrating that recognition of error and commitment to different values could create meaningful change, even when such transformation came at enormous cost to those involved. The book became required reading in post-war magical education programs designed to help students understand how prejudice and extremism could develop while providing tools for recognizing and resisting such influences when they appeared in different forms. But perhaps the most lasting aspect of the Malfoy family's legacy was the example they provided of how dramatically people could change when circumstances forced confrontation with realities that comfortable assumptions had previously obscured, while their survival and partial rehabilitation demonstrated that mercy and second chances could serve justice better than systematic punishment when those who had erred showed genuine commitment to different values. Their story became part of larger narrative about post-war healing that emphasized restoration over retribution while maintaining accountability for choices that had caused immeasurable suffering. The magical world that emerged from the conflicts that had consumed so much of their lives was more inclusive and democratic than anything previous generations had experienced. While the institutions that replaced those destroyed or discredited by association with Voldemort's regime incorporated safeguards designed to prevent similar concentration of power in hands of those whose vision might again threaten fundamental freedoms that diverse magical society required for peaceful coexistence. The Malfoy family's contributions to these developments, limited though they were by their reduced circumstances and damaged reputation, represented genuine attempt to use remaining resources for purposes that served common good rather than narrow interests. The peace that gradually settled over magical Britain following the war's end was not perfect or complete, as deep divisions and lasting trauma created challenges that would require generations to fully address, while former enemies learned to coexist in society where previous certainties about superiority and inferiority had been replaced by more complex understanding of what different backgrounds and experiences could contribute to shared prosperity. But for the Malfoy family, sitting together in manner that had been restored to serve home rather than headquarters, such peace represented achievement that their previous pursuits of power and dominance had never been able to provide. The portraits of ancestors whose supremacist beliefs had shaped family tradition for centuries now watched over descendants whose choices had broken patterns of prejudice and violence that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, while the new generation growing up in their shadow would inherit opportunities to serve rather than rule, to contribute rather than dominate, to find meaning through connection rather than superiority. The transformation was incomplete and imperfect, marked by setbacks and limitations that wealth and privilege could not entirely overcome, but it was real enough to provide foundation for hope that redemption remained possible, even for those whose choices had seemed to place them beyond possibility of genuine change. Rest now, dear listener, as our tale of Lucius Malfoy finds its complex resolution. In the gathering shadows of this peaceful night, reflect upon a man who possessed everything yet understood nothing, who wielded power yet was enslaved by it, who loved his family yet nearly destroyed them in pursuit of an ideology built on hatred and fear. His story reminds us that ambition without wisdom becomes its own prison, that the pursuit of power often costs us what we truly value, and that redemption, when it comes, may be quieter than we expect, but no less meaningful. Lucius learned, perhaps too late, that a father's love matters more than a family's reputation, that survival sometimes requires abandoning everything you thought you believed. As sleep takes hold, remember that even in the darkest choices, there remains possibility for change, for choosing family over ideology, love over hatred. In his flawed journey from privilege to disgrace to painful wisdom, Lucius Malfoy's tale becomes a lullaby about the importance of recognizing what truly matters before it's too late. Sweet dreams, and may you always choose love over legacy, truth over comfort, redemption over pride.